"Girl, why are you sitting here with this old suitcase?" The man standing in front of Annie said. He glanced up at the departure board. The orange electronic letters flickered in the night, coldly announcing that the last bus had already left. He looked at the board, then down at the girl curled up on the metal bench. "The last bus is gone," he said, his voice gentle but clear. "Do you have nowhere to go?" Annie held the old suitcase tightly against her chest and slowly lifted her head. The man standing in front of her wore a dark wool coat. In one hand, he carried a paper bag from the 24-hour fast food place across the street. Melted snow still sparkled on his shoulders like tiny pieces of glass under the station lights. Annie's lips moved, but no sound came out. She lowered her eyes to the suitcase in her arms. She held it as if it were the last thing she had left in the world. Her body was curled up on the cold bench, her shoulders slumped, her knees drawn close together. "No, sir," she whispered. The man looked at her for a moment, then glanced at the empty space beside her. "May I sit?" Annie gave a small nod. He sat down slowly, leaving enough space between them so she would not feel threatened. He placed the paper bag on his knees, leaned forward, and clasped his hands together. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Did something happen at home?" Annie tried to answer, but her face crumpled before the words could form. She tightened her grip on the suitcase and began to cry. Not loudly. It was the kind of crying that comes from someone who has held everything in for so long that they no longer have the strength to make a sound. Her shoulders trembled once, then again. She pressed her mouth against the sleeve of her coat, trying to swallow the sobs. The man did not rush her. He only sat there, waiting. After a while, Annie wiped her tears with the back of her hand. When she looked up, her eyes were red and wet beneath the harsh white lights of the station. I... Her voice caught. "I don't know what to do anymore." A man sitting on the same row of benches, 3 seats away, suddenly sat up straight as if her tears had offended him. An old duffel bag rested at his feet, and a knit cap was pulled low over his forehead. Until then, he had been leaning against the wall with his arms folded, pretending to sleep. Now he turned toward them, frowning. "Could you two keep it down?" he snapped. "Or go somewhere else? I was perfectly fine sitting here before you started all this." Annie went rigid. Her crying stopped at once, not because she felt better, but because fear had choked it back. The man in the wool coat turned his head. "She is not bothering you," he said. "She's sniffling right next to me," the other man replied. "And you're sitting there asking questions like, 'This is your living room. Some of us are trying to rest.'" "This is a public waiting bench," the older man said, his voice still calm. "You have no right to tell her to leave." The man with the duffel bag let out a bitter laugh. "Listen to you. Fancy coat, bossy voice. You think you own this place?" "No," the older man said. "That is why I'm not asking anyone to leave a public bench." The other man stared at him, his jaw tightening. For a few seconds, it looked as if he might say more. Then he snatched up his bag, rose sharply from the bench, and muttered a string of curses. "This whole bus station has lost its mind," he grumbled, dragging the bag a few steps away. "Can't even sit in peace without somebody preaching." He moved to another row of seats and turned his back to them. Annie trembled, her fingers still gripping the latch of the suitcase. "I'm sorry," she said, so softly it was barely audible. The man beside her turned back to look at her. "You do not need to apologize for crying." She wiped her face again. "People don't like noise. Some people don't like being reminded that other people are hurting." That made Annie look up at him. For the first time, she saw his face clearly. He reached into the paper bag and took out a wrapped sandwich, then a container of soup so warm that steam clouded the clear plastic lid. "I bought these across the street," he said. "I haven't touched them. You don't have to take them, but they are here." Annie shook her head. "I wasn't asking for food." "I know. I can't pay you back. I didn't ask you to." At that moment, her stomach betrayed her. It tightened at the smell of warm bread and chicken soup. She had not eaten anything real since a few bites of fries during her break at the diner. She had worked through dinner, washing dishes until her hands burned red, then returned to the house where her stepmother had already packed the suitcase for her. The man placed the sandwich on the empty space between them. "Take your time," he said. Annie hesitated. Then she reached for it, one hand still holding the suitcase tight. She peeled back the wrapper and took a small bite. She chewed slowly, embarrassed by how good it tasted and by how badly it made her want to cry again. The man waited patiently. "My name is Richard Whitmore," he he said after a moment. Annie's eyes lifted at once. She knew that name. Who in Cleveland didn't? Whitmore Holdings was printed on buildings downtown, on hospital sponsorship signs, and on charity banners hanging outside schools and churches. "You're Mr. Whitmore?" she asked. "Yes." She looked down again, suddenly more aware than ever of her worn old coat, her diner uniform still smelling faintly of grease, and the suitcase clutched against her chest like a shield. "What is your name?" he asked. "Annie Johnson." "All right, Annie Johnson," Richard said. "I am not here to frighten you. But I also could not walk past you and pretend I did not see you." Annie looked down. Richard nodded gently toward the suitcase. "Is that yours?" "It was my mother's." "Where is she now?" "She died when I was little." "I'm sorry." He said it simply, without rushing to fill the silence afterward with empty comfort. "My father remarried," Annie said. "Her name is Marilyn. She's my stepmother." Richard listened. At first, she was nice when other people were around. The ladies from church, the neighbors, teachers. But at home, Annie stopped, rubbing her thumb over the frayed seam of the suitcase. "After my little sister was born, she started saying I cost too much. Food, school fees, clothes, bus fare. She said I should be grateful she still let me stay." Richard's brow tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. "I work after school at Ray's Diner," Annie continued. "I save my tips. I write down every dollar in a notebook. I was trying to save for college." Her voice caught when she said the word college. "Tonight, she said money was missing from the kitchen drawer." "Your stepmother said that?" Annie nodded. "She went through my bag and found my cash." "My cash. Money I earned myself. Then she said I had stolen it from her. She called me a thief in front of my father." "What did he say?" Annie let out a very small laugh, dry and painful. "Nothing that helped me." Richard's eyes stayed fixed on her face. "He was drunk," she said. "He's usually drunk in the evenings. I kept waiting for him to stand up and say something. Just once. I kept thinking, he knows me. He knows I wouldn't steal, but he just sat there and told me not to make things worse." The overhead speaker crackled, announcing a delayed route in a flat, tired voice. Near the vending machines, a security guard yawned and looked down at his phone. "Then Marilyn threw this at me." Annie looked down at the suitcase. She had already packed it. "That's how I knew she had planned it before I even got home." Richard's face hardened. "She told me to leave before she called the police," Annie said. "She said no one would believe me anyway." Before Richard could answer, the man with the duffel bag came back. He stood at the end of the row, one hand gripping the strap of his bag, his lips pressed together as if he had been waiting for the right moment to cut in. "Come on," he said. "You actually believe all that?" Annie froze. Richard turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" The man jerked his chin toward Annie. "She's laying it on thick. Evil stepmother, drunk father, old suitcase, nowhere to go. I've heard stories like this plenty of times. They make it sad enough, then somebody opens their wallet." Annie's face went pale. She quickly lowered her head. Richard stood. He did not spring up quickly, but the change in him seemed to fill the space around them. "That is enough," Richard said. The man with the duffel bag snorted. "I'm just warning you. Some people don't want to work. They want sympathy." Richard stepped closer. His voice sharpened. "You don't know her. I know the type." "No," Richard said louder, making several people turn their heads. "You decided who she was before you ever heard her speak." The man's face flushed. "Don't talk to me like I'm stupid. Then don't stand here proving you are cruel." The words landed like a slap. The man blinked, angry and embarrassed. Richard pointed toward the other side of the waiting area. "Sit somewhere else, or leave, but do not stand there calling her a liar while I am sitting here." The man muttered something. "What was that?" Richard asked. He looked at Richard's coat, then at his face. Whatever courage he had drawn from Annie's silence began to drain away. "Nothing," he said. "Good." The man backed off, still grumbling under his breath. "Rich people always love talking down to folks," he muttered, dragging his bag to the other side of the waiting area. "This whole place is nonsense." He turned his back and did not come near them again. Richard waited until the man had sat down. Then he returned to the bench, but he did not sit as close as before. He left Annie room to breathe. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he said. Annie shook her head and wiped her tears with her sleeve. He's not the first. That does not make it true. No, she whispered. It just makes it familiar. Richard looked at her for a long time, and something in his expression changed. It was not pity. If it had been pity, Annie would have closed herself off immediately. He sat down again. Tell me the rest, he said. Annie placed both hands on the suitcase, as if she needed it to keep herself from falling apart. She said I thought I was better than everyone because of college, Annie said. She said I thought I was too good to live in that house. But I never said that. I just wanted to leave. Not because I hated them. I just wanted to go somewhere I could breathe. Richard listened without interrupting. She grabbed my backpack and dumped everything onto the living room floor. My notebook, my work shirt, everything. Then she held up my tips like she had caught me doing something terrible. Annie's lips trembled. I tried to explain. I told her she could ask Mr. Ray at the diner to prove I had taken extra shifts. I told her I had written down every dollar. But she just laughed. And your father? He looked at me like, Annie stopped, searching for the right words. Like he wanted me to forgive him before he even failed me. Richard's eyes lowered. Before I got home, she had already packed some of my clothes, Annie said. Not all of them. Just enough to make it look like she was still giving me something. She kept some of my papers. I think she kept my mother's scarf, too. I couldn't find it. This suitcase belonged to your mother, Richard said. Annie nodded. She used to take it when we visited my grandmother. I remember sitting on it when I was little while she braided my hair. The zipper was already broken back then. Her fingers moved lightly over the old seam. When Marilyn threw it at my feet, I wanted to leave it there. I didn't want her to see me pick up something she had just thrown away. Annie swallowed hard, but it was my mother's. So I picked it up. Outside, a bus pulled up to the curb, its engine rumbling beneath the station's white lights, then rolled away without opening its doors. Its headlights swept across Annie's shoes, the old suitcase, and Richard's hands resting calmly on his knees. Annie, Richard said, is there anyone I can call for you? A teacher? A friend? An aunt? Anyone? My friend isn't answering. My phone is almost dead. I don't have any family nearby. She took a deep, trembling breath. And I can't go back there tonight. I'm not asking you to go back. Annie watched him carefully. Richard reached into his coat and took out a business card. He placed it on the bench instead of handing it directly to her, as if he did not want to force her to accept anything. I'm going to call my sister, he said. Her name is Grace. She is a lawyer. I will put her on speaker so you can hear everything. Then I will call Mrs. Helen, my housekeeper. She will prepare a guest room and be there when we arrive. If you do not feel safe coming with me, I will pay for a hotel room in your name and ask Grace to meet you there. You choose. Annie stared at him. Why are you doing this? Richard looked toward the glass doors, where people kept coming and going, each one looking just long enough to decide they did not need to stop. Because you have been sitting here all night, he said, and too many people have decided it was none of their business. Annie looked down at her mother's suitcase. A few minutes ago, it had felt like proof that she had been abandoned. But now, held tightly in her arms, it felt like the last piece of herself she had managed to keep. She nodded, very slightly, still not fully able to believe it. Richard took out his phone and began to make the call. Richard made the call, then placed the phone at an angle between them so Annie could see the screen. He did not turn his back. He did not lower his voice the way other adults often did when they were about to decide something for her without asking what she wanted. A woman answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was rough with sleep, but strangely alert. Richard? It's past midnight. I know, I'm sorry. You only apologize before bad news. What happened? Richard looked at Annie before answering. I'm at the downtown bus station, he said. I'm sitting with a young woman named Annie Johnson. She was put out of her home tonight and has nowhere safe to go. She is here with an old suitcase and a phone that is almost dead. I told her I would call you on speaker. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Annie heard sheets rustling, then the click of a light switch. Hello, Annie, the woman said. My name is Grace Whitmore. I'm Richard's sister, and I'm an attorney. You don't have to answer anything tonight that you don't want to answer. First, are you hurt anywhere? Annie glanced at Richard, then looked down at her cold hands. No, ma'am, she said softly. My hands are just a little cold. Do you feel safe sitting beside my brother right now? Annie hesitated. because safe was a word that had become very expensive in her life. I think so. That is enough, Grace said. Richard, do not take her anywhere until she understands her options. I know. Grace let out a small breath. I'm saying that because when you are in front of someone who needs help, you usually care first and think second. Richard accepted the reminder without arguing. Grace continued speaking to Annie. Annie, because you are old enough to make your own decisions, no one can force you to go back to that house tonight. You can go to a hotel, a shelter, a friend's home, or somewhere private if you choose. If you decide to go to Richard's house, I will document that it was your decision. Mrs. Helen will be there when you arrive. She has worked with our family for 22 years, and she does not tolerate foolishness from anyone, including Richard. Annie almost smiled, but the smile came and went too quickly. After that, Richard called Mrs. Helen. She answered even faster than Grace. Mr. Whitmore? Helen, I'm sorry for waking you. If you were truly that sorry, you wouldn't have called. Go on. The corner of Richard's mouth softened. I'm bringing a guest home. Her name is Annie. She needs a warm room, some food if she wants it, and a quiet place. A young woman? Yes. Then I'll put fresh sheets on the blue room bed and warm up some soup. Does the girl have any allergies? Richard looked at Annie. No, ma'am, Annie said, her voice almost a breath, but Mrs. Helen still heard her. All right, baby. Chicken noodle soup unless you hate it. I don't hate it. Good, then we'll start there. When the call ended, Annie remained still. The glow from the phone screen in Richard's hand slowly faded. Richard stood and picked up the paper bag. We can leave whenever you're ready, he said. There is no hurry. Annie looked toward the glass doors. Outside, the sidewalk shone slick with old melting snow. Richard's black car sat beneath the station lights, clean and silent, the kind of car people noticed at a glance because it did not belong in places like this. I don't have the right clothes to go to your house, she said. You don't need special clothes to be warm. My shoes are wet. Floors can be dried. I might cry again. Helen has tissues. This time, Annie's tired smile stayed a little longer. She stood slowly, holding the suitcase tightly. Richard did not reach out to carry it for her. Somehow, he understood that the suitcase was no longer simply luggage. It was the last boundary Annie still had for herself. She pulled it behind her. The broken wheel caught once on the tile floor, then rolled on with a weary scraping sound. As they passed the row of seats where the man with the duffel bag had moved, he kept his face turned toward the window. Annie felt his silence, but this time it could not touch her the same way. Richard walked beside her, not ahead of her, not behind her. At the door, the security guard looked up. You two leaving? He asked. Yes, Richard replied. The guard looked at Annie's suitcase, then at Richard's coat. Something like recognition passed briefly across his face. Everything all right? Richard opened the door for Annie. It's being handled. The cold struck Annie's face at once. She tightened her grip on the suitcase handle and stepped outside. The air smelled strongly of diesel, wet asphalt, and road salt. A bus sat far down the curb with no passengers, its engine rumbling like a sleeping animal. Richard's car unlocked with a soft click. He opened the front passenger door, then stopped. You can sit in the back if you want, he said, or in the front. Your choice. Annie looked at the back seat, then the front seat. Having a choice was what unsettled her. At home, choices were usually traps. Choose wrong, and Marilyn would call her ungrateful. Choose right, and Marilyn would change the rules. The front is fine, Annie said. Richard nodded and stepped aside. She placed the suitcase on the front seat and sat down beside it instead of putting it in the trunk. Richard noticed, but he said nothing. He only closed the door gently. Through the windshield, Annie watched him walk around the car and get in on the other side. For a full minute, Richard did not start the engine. The heater will warm up quickly, he said. If you want it, the seat warmer button is on the side of the door. Annie saw the button, but she did not press it. Richard started the car. Warm air began to flow from the vents. The station slowly fell behind them as the car pulled away from the curb. Annie held the suitcase with one hand and the unopened soup container Richard had given her with the other. The warmth made her frozen fingers begin to ache. They drove past closed shops. A pawn shop with bars across its windows. A church sign that read Community Meal Thursday at 5 p.m. And a gas station where two men stood under white lights drinking coffee from paper cups. Annie watched everything as if she were leaving one familiar city and entering another, even though the streets looked exactly the same. Richard kept his eyes on the road. Grace will come in the morning. he said. She will explain everything again after you wake up. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep. You don't have to sleep right away. The room will still be there. Annie rubbed her thumb over the seam of the suitcase. Marilyn has some of my documents. What kind of documents? My birth certificate, my social security card, maybe my school records too. My college acceptance letter is in my backpack. But I don't know if she kept the rest. We will handle that tomorrow. She won't give them back. Then we will ask in a way she understands. Annie turned and looked at the side of his face. You don't know her? No, Richard said, but I know paperwork, and I know lawyers. For the first time that night, Annie felt a breath leave her chest without trembling. The houses began to change as they drove farther out. Richard turned onto a long road lined with bare trees. At the end of it stood a large brick house with white trim and a porch light glowing on the front steps. It was not flashy the way Annie had imagined a billionaire's house would be. It was old, quiet, and too large for one person living alone. A woman stood waiting in the doorway. She wore a gray cardigan over her nightclothes, her silver hair pinned neatly back. She was short, broad-shouldered, and had the bearing of a woman who had raised children, buried loved ones, argued with plumbers, and still managed to make soup on time. That's Mrs. Helen, Richard said. Annie's hand tightened. Richard turned off the engine. You can still change your mind. Annie looked at the house, then back at the dark road behind them. There was no place waiting for her in that direction. I'll go in, she said. Richard got out first and opened the door for her. Annie climbed out, pulling the suitcase with her before he could help. Mrs. Helen waited on the porch, not smiling too much, and not performing kindness in a way that felt forced. Annie Johnson? She asked. Yes, ma'am. I'm Helen Carter. I hope I'm not related to whoever made you look this tired. Annie blinked. Richard glanced at Mrs. Helen. What? Helen said. The child should know I don't have a criminal record. Despite herself, Annie let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. Mrs. Helen stepped aside. Come in. The soup is warm. Towels are in the bathroom. You can eat first or bathe first. Nobody is rushing you. The entryway smelled faintly of lemon polish, old wood, and chicken broth. Annie crossed the threshold with the suitcase in her hand. Her wet shoes squeaked on the floor, and she immediately looked down. I'm sorry. Mrs. Helen closed the door. For having feet, don't start apologizing for things God gave you. Richard hung his coat on a hook. Annie stood still, not knowing whether she should take off her shoes, where to put the suitcase, or whether touching anything in this house would prove she did not belong there. Mrs. Helen seemed to read all of it without staring. You can put that suitcase anywhere that makes it easier for you to breathe, she said. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about kindness, hope, and the power of being seen when you feel forgotten. Annie carried it into the small sitting room beside the hallway and placed it beside the chair closest to the door. Mrs. Helen brought out soup in a white bowl, not filled too high, with crackers on a plate and a glass of water. Richard still stood in the doorway. I'll be in the kitchen, he said. Helen will show you to the room when you're ready. Annie looked from him to the bowl of soup. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. He left before the moment became too heavy. Annie sat down and placed the bowl of soup on her lap. The first spoonful burned her tongue a little, but she kept eating. Mrs. Helen sat in the chair across from her, holding a cup of tea, and did not ask for her story. That was her kindness. A few minutes later, Annie's shoulders slowly lowered. Not much, just enough for the suitcase beside her to stop trembling. Annie finished half the soup before her body reminded her how tired it was. The spoon slowed in her hand. Across from her, Mrs. Helen pretended not to notice until Annie blinked too long over the bowl. That's enough for tonight, Helen said. Soup keeps. Pride does not need to finish a whole bowl at 1 in the morning. Annie looked up. I'm not trying to be rude. I know. You're trying to be no trouble. Different thing. Annie lowered the spoon. She did not know what to do with that, so she folded the napkin beside the bowl and set it under the spoon as carefully as if she were leaving a restaurant table. Mrs. Helen rose with a quiet effort, took the bowl, and nodded toward the hall. Come on. I'll show you where to wash up. Annie grabbed the suitcase before following. The hallway was wide, with framed black and white photographs along one wall. A younger Richard standing beside a woman with kind eyes, a charity dinner, a ribbon cutting, A small sailboat on Lake Erie. A family Christmas photo from years ago. Annie tried not to stare, but the house held history in a way Marilyn's never had. Marilyn's house held arguments in the walls. The guest room was upstairs, painted a soft blue that looked gray in the lamplight. A bed stood against the far wall with a white quilt folded at the foot. There was a dresser, a reading chair, a small lamp, and a bathroom through the side door. No clutter. No locked drawers. No one else's storage boxes shoved into the corners. Mrs. Helen set two towels on the bed. Bathroom's yours tonight. Soap's in the dish. Toothbrush still wrapped by the sink. If you need anything, my room's down the hall. Mr. Whitmore is on the first floor. He does not come up here unless the roof is leaking or I tell him to. Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. Helen looked at the suitcase in Annie's hand. You can keep that right where you want it. Annie placed it beside the bed, close enough that she could reach the handle from the mattress. Mrs. Helen saw that too. She did not comment. At the door, she paused. Annie? Yes, ma'am? You don't have to earn the bed. The words were plain, but they found a place in Annie she had been trying to keep boarded up. She looked at the quilt, then down at her shoes. I don't know if I can sleep in it. Then sit on it first. Work your way up. Helen left the door open a few inches and the hall light on. Annie stood in the middle of the room until the house settled around her. Pipes clicked somewhere in the walls. A furnace came on with a low hum. Downstairs, a cabinet closed. Then silence returned. She went into the bathroom and washed her hands twice. The water ran gray at first from bus station grime and the diner shift. She looked at herself in the mirror. Red eyes, dry lips, hair pulled back too tight, uniform shirt wrinkled under the coat. She looked like someone who had been sent away. She removed the coat but not the uniform. She brushed her teeth with the new toothbrush and felt guilty about opening it. Then she sat on the edge of the bed with one hand on the suitcase handle. The mattress gave under her weight, soft enough to make her uneasy. Her phone had died sometime between the station and the house. She plugged it into the charger Helen had placed on the nightstand. When the screen came alive, there were no missed calls from her father. There was one message from Marilyn. Don't come crawling back tomorrow. You made your choice. Annie stared at it until the letters blurred. Then another message came in. And if you tell people lies about this family, I'll make sure they know what you really are. Annie turned the phone face down. For a while she sat without moving. She thought of Frank in the recliner. One boot on, one boot off. She thought of Lily on the stairs. She thought of her mother's blue scarf missing from the suitcase. Then she opened the old case and checked what she had, because counting was something she could do when feeling was too much. 2 shirts. 1 sweater. Jeans. Her college letter. The savings notebook. A cracked frame with her mother's photograph wrapped in a t-shirt. A pair of socks Marilyn had packed that did not match. No birth certificate. No social security card. No school folder. No blue scarf. She touched the photograph through the cotton. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she did not know who she was saying it to. Downstairs, Richard stood in the kitchen with both hands on the counter, looking at nothing. Mrs. Helen came in carrying Annie's half-empty bowl. She eat? He asked. Enough. Did she say anything else? Not to me, which means I did something right. Richard nodded. He looked older than he had at the station. Helen set the bowl by the sink. You going to tell me what happened? He gave her the short version. The bus station. The suitcase. The stepmother. The father, too. Drunk to stand up. The man with the duffel, who thought cruelty counted as common sense. Helen's mouth tightened. People get brave with children and tired girls. Funny how that works. She's not a child. No, Helen said. But she's young enough to have deserved better from every adult in that house. Richard looked toward the stairway. Grace is coming in the morning. Good. I don't know what I'm doing. At least you know that much. He gave a humorless breath. That's comforting. It should be. Dangerous people are the ones who think kindness makes them experts. Richard leaned back against the counter. I almost drove past. Helen rinsed the bowl. But you didn't. I wanted to. That part's between you and God. The part that matters to her is you stopped. Richard did not answer. A few minutes later, he walked to the small study off the hall. It had once been a warmer room. Now it held books, files, and a leather chair he rarely sat in. On the shelf near the window was a silver-framed photograph of his wife, Margaret, taken at a fundraiser 15 years earlier. She had been laughing at someone outside the frame, one hand raised as if she were about to tell Richard to stop looking so serious. He picked up the photograph. "You would have known what to say," he said quietly. The room gave nothing back. Richard had built his life around useful distance. Donations, grants, boards, foundations. Need came to him as numbers, proposals, quarterly reports. Numbers could be reviewed, proposals could be approved, checks could be signed and mailed, but a young woman at a bus station with red eyes and an old suitcase did not fit into any column. His phone buzzed. "Grace, did you get her settled?" He typed back. "Helen has her upstairs. You should see Marilyn Carter's name if you can before morning." Grace replied almost at once. "Already started. Get some sleep. And Richard, do not promise that girl anything you cannot keep." He read the message twice. Upstairs, Annie finally took off her shoes. She lined them beside the bed with the toes pointing toward the door. She lay down on top of the quilt instead of under it, still in her uniform, and pulled a folded blanket over her legs. Her suitcase sat against the mattress, handle facing her. She kept one hand on it until sleep dragged her under. She woke before dawn, heart racing, unsure where she was. For one wild second, she thought Marilyn had locked her in a strange room. Then she saw the blue walls, the lamp, the towels, the suitcase, and remembered. The house was quiet, too quiet. At Marilyn's house, mornings began with cabinet doors, a television too loud, Lily asking for cereal, Marilyn complaining about crumbs, Frank coughing in the bathroom. Here, the silence felt expensive and breakable. Annie got up, made the bed with sharp corners, folded the blanket twice, wiped the sink though it was already clean, and carried her empty water glass downstairs. She followed the smell of coffee and toast to the kitchen. Mrs. Helen stood at the stove in slippers, turning bacon with tongs. "You're up early," Helen said. "I usually open at the diner on Saturdays. You working today?" Annie froze. "I don't know. I left my work shoes at home. I mean, not home. At the house." She corrected herself quickly. "I can call Mr. Ray when my phone charges. Breakfast first. I can help. You can sit. I don't mind." "I didn't say you did," Helen pointed to a chair. "Sit before I give you something complicated like watching toast." Annie sat. Richard entered a few minutes later in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled, no tie, reading glasses in one hand. He stopped when he saw Annie at the table, as if he had expected to find evidence she had run. "Morning," he said. "Good morning, sir." "Richard is fine." Annie nodded but did not use it. Helen put eggs, toast, and bacon in front of her. Annie waited until Richard sat before picking up her fork. He noticed. Helen noticed. Neither said anything. Grace arrived just after 8, carrying a leather folder and wearing the expression of a woman who had already made 3 phone calls before coffee. She greeted Annie with a handshake, not a hug. "I'm glad you're safe," Grace said. "Now let's make sure you stay that way." Annie folded her hands in her lap. "Am I in trouble?" Grace pulled out a chair. "No. But people who did wrong often like to make the person they hurt feel responsible. We're not going to let that happen if we can help it." Richard poured coffee. "Did you find anything?" Grace opened the folder. Marilyn Carter. Married Frank Johnson 6 years ago. No criminal record that jumped out overnight. A few civil disputes, unpaid bills. One complaint from a neighbor that went nowhere. Frank has 2 public intoxication citations from years back. Nothing useful by itself. Annie stared at the table. Hearing their names in a folder made her life sound official. Like a case file instead of a house she had once tried to survive. Grace softened her tone. "Annie, Richard told me some of your documents may still be at the house. Birth certificate, social security card, school records. Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am. Do you have your college letter?" Annie nodded. "In the suitcase." "Good. Do you have any proof the cash was yours?" "My notebook, and Mr. Ray at the diner. He knows I took extra shifts. Will he tell the truth?" "Yes, he's strict, but he's fair." "Then we'll call him today. After that, we'll decide how to approach your father and stepmother." Annie's fork stayed untouched beside the eggs. "Do I have to see her?" "Not alone," Grace said. "Not if you don't want to. Annie looked at Richard. She won't give anything back if I ask. Richard sat across from her, not too close, his coffee untouched. Then you won't be the only one asking. Annie's eyes dropped before the gratitude in them could become tears. She picked up her fork because it was easier than speaking. For the first time since the door closed behind her, the next day did not feel like a wall. It felt like a road she did not have to walk by herself. Grace did not let the morning turn into a debate. She took out a yes? First, she said, we confirm what belongs to you. Second, we call your employer. Third, we contact your school. After that, we decide whether we go to the house today or tomorrow. Annie sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a glass of orange juice she had not drunk. Do we have to call school? You don't have to explain everything, Grace said. But if your stepmother has your documents, your counselor may have copies. And if college is the goal, we protect the paper trail. Richard leaned against the counter, arms folded. Who helped you apply? My English teacher, Mrs. Parker. Would she answer on a Saturday? Annie almost smiled. She answers everybody. That's kind of her problem. Grace slid her phone across the table. Call her. Annie stared at the phone as if it weighed more than it should. At Marilyn's house, phone calls had always been something to fear. Bills, complaints, teachers, people asking questions that made Marilyn angry later. She dialed slowly from memory. Mrs. Evelyn Parker answered after 2 rings. Hello? Mrs. Parker? It's Annie. There was a small shift in the woman's voice. Concern arrived before the words did. Annie, honey, are you all right? Annie closed her eyes. That question, asked without suspicion, nearly undid her. I'm safe. I'm with people helping me. Grace nodded for her to continue. I got put out last night, Annie said. Marilyn said I stole money. I didn't. She kept some of my papers. I have my college letter, but maybe not everything else. Mrs. Parker was quiet for half a breath. Where are you right now? Annie looked at Richard. He gave a small nod. At Mr. Richard Whitmore's house. He found me at the bus station. Mrs. Parker exhaled. Not relief exactly, but something close. All right, I know his foundation. Is there an adult woman there with you? Yes, his sister is an attorney. Mrs. Helen is here too. Good. Put me on speaker. Annie did. Mrs. Parker's voice filled the kitchen. Steady now. Annie Johnson is one of the most disciplined students I've had in 20 years. If someone is saying she stole, they had better bring proof stronger than their temper. Annie looked down fast. Grace picked up her pen. Mrs. Parker, this is Grace Whitmore. We may need copies of Annie's school records and any college application documents you helped with. I can get what the school is legally allowed to provide. I also have copies of recommendation letters and a scan of her acceptance packet. I made backups because Annie worries about losing things. I don't lose things, Annie said softly. Mrs. Parker's tone warmed. No, you don't. That's why I knew there was a reason when you asked me to keep copies. Grace asked a few more questions. Mrs. Parker confirmed Annie's attendance, grades, scholarship deadlines, and the name of the admissions counselor at Lake Erie State. Before hanging up, her voice shifted back to Annie. Listen to me. Whatever happened in that house, it does not cancel what you earned. Do you understand? Annie tried to answer, but only nodded. Annie, Mrs. Parker said, Yes, ma'am, I understand. After the call, Grace wrote for a minute. Richard looked out the kitchen window toward the bare trees behind the house. Mrs. Helen set another piece of toast near Annie's plate without making a point of it. The next call was to Ray's diner. Mr. Ray answered over the noise of plates and the breakfast crowd. Ray's. Mr. Ray, it's Annie. Annie, you were supposed to open at 7. You sick? No, sir. I'm sorry. Something happened last night. You safe? The question was blunt, but not unkind. Yes, sir. Grace leaned closer. Mr. Ray, this is Grace Whitmore. Annie has been accused by a family member of stealing money that she says came from tips and extra shifts. Can you confirm whether she worked last night and whether she was paid cash? Ray did not hesitate. She worked 4 to 11. Picked up Carla's last 2 hours because Carla's kid had a fever. I gave Annie 20 in cash for the extra time, and she made tips. girl writes every dollar in that little notebook like the IRS is hiding under table 6. Annie's face warmed. Did she leave with anything from the diner that wasn't hers? Grace asked. She left with sore feet and probably no dinner because she never takes her break right. That's what she left with. Richard's mouth tightened. Ray continued, You tell whoever's accusing Annie they can call me. I don't have much patience, but I got a long memory. When the call ended, Grace tapped her pen once against the pad. Good. That gives us 2 reliable adults and a timeline. Annie finally drank some orange juice. It tasted too sweet. Grace closed the folder. We should go today. The longer Marilyn has the documents, the more time she has to misplace them. Annie's stomach clenched. She'll make a scene. Probably, Grace said. Richard straightened. Then she makes it in front of witnesses. Mrs. Helen, who had been wiping the counter, turned. I'm coming. Richard looked at her. Helen, don't Helen me. A young woman walking back into a house that threw her out should not have to do it with only lawyers and men. Grace pointed her pen toward Helen. That's the first sensible thing anyone has said all morning. By noon, they were in Richard's car. Grace drove her own and followed behind. Mrs. Helen sat in the back with Annie, leaving the suitcase between them. Richard had asked if Annie wanted to leave it at the house. She said no. He did not ask twice. The streets grew familiar too quickly. Annie watched corner stores, narrow porches, chain-link fences, the laundromat with the broken sign. By the time they turned onto her block, her fingers had gone cold again. Marilyn's house looked smaller in daylight. Beige siding, 2 plastic chairs on the porch, a wreath on the door that said, Bless this home. Annie had always hated that wreath. Richard parked at the curb. Grace stepped out with her folder. Helen touched Annie's sleeve. You breathe when you walk, Helen said. People forget. Annie nodded. Marilyn opened the door before they knocked, as if she had been watching from the window. Her face changed when she saw Richard. The anger she had prepared rearranged itself into confusion, then concern. Annie, she said, soft as church music. Where on earth have you been? We were worried sick. Annie felt Helen stiffen beside her. Grace stepped forward. Marilyn Carter? Yes. I'm Grace Whitmore. I represent Annie for the purpose of recovering her personal documents and belongings. Marilyn's eyes flicked to Richard. Represent? What has she been telling you? Richard said nothing. Marilyn pressed a hand to her chest. This is a family misunderstanding. Annie gets emotional. She storms off. Then people make it bigger than it is. Annie could hear last night in her head. Thief, get out. Nobody will believe you. Grace opened her folder. We're here for her birth certificate, social security card, school records, any college documents, personal clothing, and items belonging to her late mother. Marilyn's smile thinned. Those papers are in this house because children lose things. Annie is old enough to possess her own identification. She lives under my roof. Not anymore, Grace said. For a second, Marilyn's eyes hardened. Then she looked past Grace to Richard. Mr. Whitmore, I don't know what she said, but Annie has always had a flair for drama. She took money from our kitchen drawer. We were trying to handle it privately. Richard's voice came quiet. She was at work during the time you claim she stole it. Marilyn blinked. Grace added, her employer confirmed her hours and the cash payment she received. Her teacher has also confirmed her college records. So let's not waste time. From inside, Frank's voice drifted down the hall. Who is it? Annie's chest tightened. Frank appeared behind Marilyn, unshaven, sober enough to look ashamed and sick enough to wish he were not. His eyes found Annie. Baby, he said. Marilyn shot him a warning look. Annie held the suitcase handle. I need my papers. Frank rubbed a hand over his mouth. Marilyn. Where are they? The question hung there, small but real. Marilyn turned on him. Don't start. Grace stepped into the doorway without crossing the threshold. We can do this politely, or we can request law enforcement standby while Annie retrieves her documents. I'd rather not spend my Saturday doing the second. Marilyn stared at her, then at Richard, then at Annie, who had not lowered her eyes. Fine, Marilyn said. Wait here. She disappeared down the hall. Frank remained by the stairs, looking older than he had the night before. I didn't know where you went, he said. Annie's answer came before she could soften it. You didn't ask before I left. He flinched. Upstairs, a door opened. Lily appeared at the landing, still in pajamas though it was afternoon. She held something blue clutched in one hand. Marilyn came back with a manila envelope and shoved it toward Grace. Here, birth certificate, card, school things. Happy? Grace checked inside. Almost. Annie looked up at Lily. Lily came down 2 steps, eyes on her mother. Annie forgot something. Marilyn snapped, Lily, but Lily kept coming. She reached the bottom step and held out the blue silk scarf, wrinkled but whole. Annie took it with both hands. For a second, the room blurred. "Thank you," she whispered. Lily nodded, scared but steady. Marilyn's face twisted. "Are we done now?" Grace looked at Annie. "Are we?" Annie glanced once toward the living room, toward the recliner where her father had sat silent while Marilyn threw her out. Then she looked at the suitcase in her hand, the envelope in Grace's folder, the scarf folded against her palm. "Yes," she said, "we're done." Outside, the cold felt different, still sharp, still Cleveland in late November, but Annie could breathe in it. Richard opened the car door. Annie slid into the back beside Mrs. Helen, placing the scarf carefully inside the suitcase on top of her mother's photograph. As they pulled away, she did not look back at the porch or the wreath or the window where Marilyn stood watching. For the first time, leaving that house did not feel like being thrown out. It felt like taking herself with her. Back at Richard's house, Annie carried the suitcase upstairs herself. No one offered to take it, and she was grateful for that. Mrs. Helen walked behind her with the manila envelope Grace had checked twice before handing over, and Richard stayed downstairs to speak with Grace in the kitchen. The house was quiet in the afternoon light, too quiet for the amount of feeling Annie had brought into it. In the blue room, she set the suitcase on the bed and opened it. The blue scarf lay on top of her mother's photograph. Annie touched it with 2 fingers, then lifted it to her face. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet, and under that, maybe only because Annie wanted it to be there, a trace of the hair oil her mother used when Annie was small. Mrs. Helen stood near the door. "You want me to leave you with it?" Annie shook her head, then nodded, then looked embarrassed by both. Helen understood anyway. "I'll sit in the chair. I won't talk unless you do." Annie folded the scarf carefully and placed it around the frame. Her mother's face looked out from the cracked glass, smiling in the sun outside the old church. Annie had carried that picture through every move inside the same house. From the larger bedroom after her mother died, to the smaller room after Marilyn moved in, to the corner room after Lily was born and needed more space for toys. Now the photograph sat in a stranger's house, and somehow it looked less lonely than it had in Annie's own room. "She used to tie this scarf around her hair on Sundays," Annie said. Helen's voice was low. "Blue suited her?" "Everything suited her. That's what my dad used to say." Annie swallowed. Before he started forgetting what he used to say, Helen did not answer too quickly. "Grief can break a person, but it does not give them permission to drop the pieces on their child." Annie looked at the photograph. "He wasn't always like that." "I believe you." That made Annie's throat tighten. People often argued with love after it had failed. They wanted the good memories thrown out with the bad, as if that made the damage simpler. Helen did not ask Annie to hate her father cleanly. That was a kindness too. Downstairs, Grace spread the documents across Richard's kitchen table. Birth certificate, social security card, school transcript, a folder from Lake Erie State University with Annie's acceptance letter, financial aid estimate, and a list of forms still required. There were coffee mugs between them, untouched. Richard looked at the papers. "Is anything missing?" "Medical card, maybe some tax information if she needs aid verification," Grace said. "But this is enough to keep moving." "Can Marilyn still interfere?" Grace leaned back. "Legally, not much. Practically, yes. People don't need legal rights to cause harm. They only need access, a phone, and a story they're willing to repeat." Richard's eyes moved toward the ceiling. "Then we limit access. Carefully. Annie gets a say. She is not a package we're relocating." "I know that." Grace studied him. "Do you?" Richard looked at her. Grace softened, but only a little. "You brought her here because you saw something wrong. Good. But now comes the harder part. You can't fix her life by moving fast. You can make calls, write checks, open doors, She still has to walk through them herself. Richard picked up Annie's savings notebook. Grace had not opened it, but Annie had given permission for them to verify the dates and amounts. On the first page, Annie had written in careful pencil, "College fund. Do not touch unless necessary." Underneath were small entries. $12.50 tips. $20 extra shift. $7 bus money. $3.25 laundry. $15 saved. Line after line of a girl building a future out of dollars other people would not bend down to pick up. "I understand," Richard said. Grace saw his face. "No, you're beginning to." That evening, Annie came downstairs wearing the same clothes, though Mrs. Helen had washed and dried her coat. The blue scarf was tied loosely around her ponytail. It made her look younger for a second, then steadier. Richard stood when she entered the kitchen. Annie noticed and did not know what to do with it. Men in Marilyn's house did not stand for her. Frank had barely stood for himself. Grace gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit with us a minute. We need to talk about practical things." Annie sat, placing her hands in her lap. "Your documents are safe," Grace said. "I'll make copies tomorrow. Originals stay with you, unless you want them in a lockbox here. I can keep them? They're yours." Annie blinked. Marilyn always said important papers had to stay with adults. Grace's mouth tightened. That is something adults say when they want control. Richard poured a glass of water and set it near Annie, not too close. "We also called Lake Erie State. Nothing has changed with your acceptance." Annie's shoulders dropped so suddenly she seemed embarrassed by the relief. "They didn't take it back?" "No," Grace said. "Colleges do not revoke acceptance because a stepmother has a temper." Annie looked at the table. "She'll call them." "She might," Grace said. "I've already spoken to admissions. They made a note that all communication about your file goes through you and your listed email. Tomorrow we'll help you change passwords." Annie nodded slowly. "Okay." Richard sat across from her. "There's something else. Whitmore Foundation has a student support program. It covers fees, books, transportation, sometimes housing gaps. Grace says we can apply you through the normal process. Daniel Brooks oversees it, not me." Annie's face changed. She leaned back a little. "I don't want people thinking I got something because you found me." "Then we make sure you don't," Richard said. "You apply. Your grade stand. Your teacher's recommendation stands. Your work history stands. If the committee approves you, it will be because you qualify. But you own the foundation. I fund it. I do not get to turn it into my personal apology machine." Grace gave him a quick look. "That may be the most legally useful sentence you've said all day." Annie stared at Richard, trying to find the catch. "And if they say no, then we find another honest way," he said. "Not a hidden one." Mrs. Helen placed a plate of baked chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes in front of Annie. Annie looked startled. "I didn't ask." "You're at a dinner table," Helen said. "Food happens." Annie picked up the fork. She waited until everyone else had food before she ate. The chicken was warm and plain, the kind of meal a person could trust. Halfway through, her glass slipped from the edge of her plate. It hit the floor and broke, water spreading under the chair. Annie shot up so fast the chair scraped back. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it. I didn't mean..." Richard was already reaching for a towel, but he stopped when he saw her face. She had gone pale, hands raised like she expected someone to grab her wrist. Mrs. Helen froze too. Richard lowered his voice. "Annie." She kept staring at the broken glass. "It's a glass," he said, "not a verdict." The kitchen went still. Annie looked at him. "What?" "It's a glass. It fell, that's all." Mrs. Helen moved then, slow and practical, placing a towel over the water. "Nobody bleeds, nobody shouts. That's the rule in this kitchen." Annie sank back into the chair, but she did not eat. Tears gathered again, silent and unwanted. "I hate this," she whispered. Richard sat down across from her. "The glass?" "No, that I keep acting like this. You're acting like someone who learned what happened when things went wrong." Annie wiped her cheek. At Marilyn's, everything was proof. A spill meant I was careless. A missing spoon meant I stole it. A bad grade meant I was wasting school. If Lily cried, I must have upset her. If Dad drank, I must have stressed him out. She pressed both hands to her eyes. "I'm tired." No one filled the silence with advice. After a moment, Grace said, "Then tonight we do one thing. You finish dinner if you can. You sleep if you can. Tomorrow we start with paperwork." Annie gave a small, broken laugh. "That's your answer to everything? Paperwork has saved more lives than people give it credit for." Richard glanced at Grace. "That may be the least poetic thing ever said at this table." "It's also true," Grace said. Annie breathed out, and this time it almost became a laugh. She picked up her fork again. Later, after dinner, Richard found her in the library, standing just inside the doorway. The room had tall shelves, a fireplace not lit, and a large desk under the window. Annie looked at the books the way some people looked at locked cabinets. "You can go in," he said. She stepped aside quickly. "I wasn't snooping. I didn't think you were. I like books. Then this is a good room to like." She moved toward one shelf, fingers hovering but not touching. Richard watched her read titles. History, law, biographies, business, novels Margaret had loved. Annie stopped at a worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. "My mom had this," she said. Richard looked at the book. "Take it upstairs if you want. I don't want to mess it up. Books are built for hands." She took it carefully, holding it against her chest above the old suitcase handle marks still pressed into her coat. At the stairs, she paused. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Richard is fine." She nodded, still not using it. "Why did you stop last night?" He could have said many things. That it was cold. That she looked alone. That he had money enough to help. None of those were false. But none were the whole truth. "Because my wife used to say a decent person doesn't get to choose only the comfortable moments to be decent." Annie held the book tighter. "She sounds nice." She was. "Is she gone?" "Yes." Annie understood the shape of that one word. She did not ask more. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." "Good night, Annie." Upstairs, Annie placed the book beside her mother's photograph. She put the documents in the top drawer, then opened the drawer twice to make sure they were still there. Before lying down, she moved the suitcase from the floor to the chair near the bed. Not out of reach, but not touching the mattress. It was a small distance. For that night, it was enough. By Monday morning, Annie had learned the quiet sounds of Richard's house. The furnace clicked before dawn. Mrs. Helen's slippers moved across the kitchen at 6. The coffee maker sighed at 6 to 10. Richard came down around 6:30, not heavy-footed, but steady, like a man who had been waking to responsibility for most of his life. Annie woke earlier than all of them. She sat at the edge of the blue room bed with her school folder open on her lap, checking the same documents again: birth certificate, social security card, acceptance letter, transcript copies Grace had made, Mr. Ray's written note confirming her shifts, and Mrs. Parker's printed recommendation. Everything was there. Still, she checked. The suitcase sat in the chair by the window. She had not moved it farther than that. At breakfast, Richard placed a folded sheet of paper beside her plate. "Daniel Brooks can meet with us at 10. Annie looked at the paper but did not touch it. "That's the internship person? Director of Operations for Whitmore Foundation. He handles staffing, applications, student placements. He's fair. Not soft." Mrs. Helen set oatmeal in front of Annie and said, "Fair matters more than soft." Annie stirred the oatmeal once. "What if he thinks I'm only there because of you?" "He probably will at first," Richard said. That answer made her look up. "I'd rather not lie to you," he continued. "People make assumptions. Some whisper them. Some dress them up as concern. Daniel may wonder whether I'm pushing him." "Are you?" "No. I asked him to review you for a student support placement. He can say no." Annie's spoon stopped. Richard noticed. "That wasn't meant to scare you. It was meant to make the yes mean something if it comes." Grace arrived just before 9, carrying a navy folder and wearing low heels that clicked with purpose on the kitchen floor. She handed Annie a simple resume printed on thick paper. Annie stared at it. Her name looked strange at the top. Annie Johnson. Student. Ray's Diner. Lake Erie State University. Admitted. "It looks too short," Annie said. "It's supposed to at your age," Grace replied. "You're not applying to run the Federal Reserve." Mrs. Helen poured coffee. "Give her time." Grace took the mug. "I am giving her time. I'm also keeping her from apologizing to a piece of paper." Annie almost smiled. The house had begun doing that to her at odd moments, pulling expressions out before she could stop them. Richard drove them downtown. Grace followed in her own car because, as she put it, never arrive at a legal or professional conversation without your own exit. Annie sat in the front this time after Richard offered both choices and then said nothing while she decided. Whitmore Holdings rose above East 9th Street in glass and pale stone. Annie had passed the building before on the bus. From outside, it looked like a place where people spoke in numbers too large to belong to real life. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee, winter coats, and polished floors. A security officer greeted Richard by name, then looked at Annie with professional politeness that did not quite hide curiosity. Richard did not explain her. He simply said, "Miss Johnson is with me." The elevator climbed too smoothly. Annie watched the numbers change and tried not to grip her folder too hard. Her reflection in the brushed metal doors showed a borrowed blazer from Mrs. Helen's church closet, black slacks, hair pulled back with her mother's blue scarf folded into a narrow band. She looked almost like someone who belonged, but almost felt dangerous, almost could be taken away. Daniel Brooks met them in a conference room on the 12th floor. He was in his mid-40s, black, neatly dressed, with tired eyes that suggested he had spent years listening to people explain why exceptions should be made for their favorite causes. He shook Richard's hand, then Grace's, then Annie's. "Miss Johnson, Annie is fine," she said. "Then Daniel is fine." He gestured to the table. "Have a seat." Richard remained standing for half a second. Daniel noticed. "Richard, if you're planning to hover, I'll ask you to wait outside." Annie looked at him, startled. Richard gave a short nod. "Fair enough." Grace sat back like she approved. Richard turned to Annie. "I'll be outside if you want me." Annie wanted to say stay. She also wanted to know whether she could sit in a room without him and still be heard. "I'm okay," she said. Richard left. Daniel opened her resume. "I understand there are difficult circumstances around how you came to our attention. I'm sorry for that. But I'm not going to make this interview about pity. That would waste your time." Annie breathed in. "Thank you. Tell me about Ray's Diner." So she did. Not the sad parts. The work parts. She told him about opening sugar packets into bins before the morning rush, tracking table numbers, remembering regulars' orders, cleaning the coffee station, covering shifts, handling customers who snapped their fingers as if waitresses were dogs. Daniel asked, "What do you do when someone treats you badly?" Annie considered giving the answer adults liked. Stay calm, be respectful, smile. Instead she said, "Depends how badly." Daniel's mouth moved. "Good answer. Be specific. If they're just rude, I finish the job and don't give them anything extra to use against me. If they're crossing a line, I get Mr. Ray. He acts grumpy, but he doesn't let customers put hands on staff." Daniel made a note. "And school? I keep my grades up during lunch, study hall, and after work. Mrs. Parker lets me use her classroom before the buses leave." "What do you want to study?" Annie hesitated. "Business administration, maybe nonprofit management later. I used to think I just wanted a job with a desk and heat. Now I think I want to understand how money moves. Who gets help? Who gets told to wait?" Daniel looked up from the resume then. Grace did not smile, but her pen stopped moving. After the interview, Daniel asked Annie to step out for water while he spoke with Grace. Annie knew a dismissal when she heard one, but this one did not feel cruel. In the hall, Richard stood near the windows, looking down at traffic. "How was it?" he asked. He asked real questions. "That sounds like Daniel. I don't know if I did good." "Well," Richard said, "you didn't run out. That's the standard." "Some mornings, yes." She let out a small laugh. It surprised both of them. A few minutes later, Daniel opened the door. "Annie, come back in." She sat. Daniel folded his hands. "Here's what I can offer. Part-time internship. 10 hours a week until graduation. Then we reassess for summer. Basic administrative work in the scholarship office. Filing, data entry, applicant follow-up, event prep. It pays. Not much, but it pays. You'll report to me, not Richard. If you're late, I'll say so. If your work is sloppy, I'll say so. If anyone treats you like a pet project, you tell me." Annie stared at him. "You're offering me the position? I'm offering you a chance to prove I was right too." Her eyes stung. and she hated that they did. I can do that. I hope so. Orientation Wednesday. Richard said nothing until they were back in the elevator. Then he looked at Annie's reflection in the doors. Congratulations. She held her folder to her chest. He said it pays. It does. I can pay for my own bus pass. Yes. And my phone. Yes. She nodded, as if each yes returned a piece of ground under her feet. That afternoon, Richard drove her to Ray's diner so she could speak with Mr. Ray in person. The place smelled of coffee, grilled onions, and bleach. Mr. Ray came out from behind the counter wiping his hands on a towel. He looked Annie over, then glanced at Richard. You eating or rescuing my best worker from capitalism? Annie blinked. Mr. Ray. What? I'm asking. He pointed the towel at her. You okay? I'm okay. Good. You still want shifts? Yes, sir. But I got an internship. Ray's eyebrows rose. Look at you. Fancy office and everything. It's not fancy, Richard said. It's a little fancy. Ray looked at him for the first time. You the rich one? Richard paused. I've been called that. Make sure she eats during work. She lies about breaks. I don't lie, Annie said. Ray snorted. You redefine the truth around hunger. Richard looked at Annie. She looked away. Ray softened just enough to be noticed. I'll keep you on weekends. School first, office second, diner third. Don't argue. I'm old and I own the schedule. On the way back to the car, Annie was quiet. Richard opened the passenger door. Too much for one day? No. She got in, setting the folder on her lap. Just strange. What is? People acting like my future is a real thing. Richard closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side. Before starting the engine, he looked at her. It was real before anyone acted like it. Annie turned the folder in her hands. The blue scarf at her hairline had loosened, and a small curl had escaped near her cheek. She did not fix it. For the rest of the drive, she watched Cleveland pass in pieces. Brick schools, corner stores, church signs, office towers, bus stops, with people hunched against the wind. The city looked the same as it had 3 nights ago, but Annie did not. She still had an old suitcase in a borrowed room. She still had a father who had not called. She still had Marilyn's words living too close to the surface. But now she also had a schedule. Wednesday orientation. Weekend shifts. College forms. A folder with her name on it. Not safety, not yet. But structure. And for Annie Johnson, structure felt like the first honest shape Hope had taken in years. Wednesday arrived with freezing rain tapping against Richard's kitchen windows. Annie came downstairs in the borrowed blazer, her mother's blue scarf tied neatly around her hair, and the folder tucked under one arm. She had been awake since 5, though orientation was not until 9. Mrs. Helen took one look at her and slid a plate of scrambled eggs onto the table. Sit. I'm not hungry. You can be nervous and fed at the same time. Annie sat. Richard lowered the business section of the newspaper. Daniel won't expect you to know everything on the first day. I know. You look like you don't know. I know it in my head, Annie said. My stomach is still catching up. Mrs. Helen poured coffee for Richard and orange juice for Annie. Stomachs are slow learners. At 8:15, Richard drove her downtown. He did not park in the executive garage. He stopped at the public entrance and let her out where other employees came in, balancing umbrellas, tote bags, and paper cups of coffee. Annie appreciated that more than she could say. If she was going to work there, she needed to walk through the same doors as everyone else. Inside, security issued her a temporary badge. The guard smiled politely but looked twice at Richard standing behind her. Annie noticed. Richard noticed her noticing. You lead, he said. She stepped through the turnstile first. Daniel met her on the 12th floor with a stack of forms and a paper cup of black coffee. Morning, Annie. Ready to regret saying yes? I already regretted it in the elevator. Good. Honest start. He showed her the scholarship office. 6 cubicles, a small conference room, file cabinets, a shared printer that groaned before every job, and a break area with a microwave older than some interns. 3 employees looked up as she entered. Daniel introduced them without ceremony. This is Marcia. She handles donor reports. This is Ken, compliance. This is Priya, program outreach. Annie will be helping with student files and application follow-up. She reports to me. Ben normal. Marcia, a woman in her 60s with red glasses, gave Annie a quick smile. Normal as M. Ken nodded over a spreadsheet. Priya waved with a phone tucked between her shoulder and ear. Daniel walked Annie to a small desk near the window. It had a computer, a notepad, a pen cup, and a plastic tray labeled pending. Nothing fancy, nothing personal. To Annie, it looked like a door. First rule, Daniel said. If you don't know, ask. Second rule, don't guess with student records. Third rule, don't let anybody hand you their work because you're new and polite. Annie nodded. I'm serious. Polite girls get buried under other people's laziness. I'll ask. You'll say that now. Then you'll try to figure it out alone because you don't want to bother anyone. Annie looked at him. Daniel sipped his coffee. I interview well. Her first task was simple. Compare digital scholarship applications against a checklist and flag missing documents. By 10:30, Annie had found 4 incomplete files, 2 duplicate entries, and 1 application from a student who had written the wrong school code. She hesitated before telling Daniel, worried he would think she was trying to show off. He glanced at the screen. Good catch. That student would have been marked incomplete. Not anymore. She returned to the desk with warmth spreading through her chest. Good catch. 2 words. No applause, no pity. Just the truth. Near lunch, Priya stopped by with a folder. Can you make 10 copies of these and put them in the blue binders? Annie reached for it automatically. Daniel's voice came from his office. Priya froze, then winced. Sorry. Habit. Daniel appeared in the doorway. Use the copier yourself unless it's part of her assigned work. Priya looked at Annie. He's right. That was lazy. My bad. Annie did not know people could correct themselves that quickly, without turning it into a fight. It's okay, she said. No, Priya replied. It's common, not okay. At noon, Marcia invited Annie to the break room. Annie almost said she had work to finish, but Daniel looked over the cubicle wall. Lunch is not a reward. Go eat. In the break room, Marcia opened a container of tuna salad and crackers. Annie unwrapped the sandwich Mrs. Helen had packed: turkey, lettuce, mustard, apple slices in a bag, and a cookie wrapped in wax paper. Marcia noticed the cookie. Helen Carter packed that, didn't she? Annie looked up. You know Mrs. Helen. Everybody who's worked around Richard long enough knows Mrs. Helen. She once told a board member his tie made him look like a nervous substitute teacher. Annie smiled. Ken came in for coffee and nodded toward her badge. You still in school? Yes, sir. Don't call me sir. Makes me feel like I should know where my knees went. Marcia laughed. Annie let herself laugh too, lightly, as if testing whether the room would punish it. It did not. The afternoon brought a different kind of test. A man from another department leaned on the edge of her desk and looked at her badge. You're the girl from the article, right? Richard's new project? Annie's fingers paused on the keyboard. Before she could answer, Daniel stepped out of his office. Name's Annie, not project. The man raised both hands. I didn't mean anything. Then you'll have no trouble saying it better next time. The man gave an awkward nod and left. Annie stared at the file on her screen. Her face felt hot. Daniel stopped beside her desk. You okay? Yes. That wasn't yes. I don't like people talking about me like I'm not there. Good. Don't get used to it. I already am. Daniel's expression changed. Just a little. Then get unused to it while you're here. By 4, Annie's eyes burned from the screen, but she had finished the first tray of files. Daniel reviewed her notes. You're careful, he said. Is that good? In this office, careful keeps a student from losing rent money because someone typed fast. He handed her a timesheet. Fill this out. Payroll needs direct deposit. If you don't have a bank account, Grace can help you open one. I've never had one by myself. Then it's time. Richard was waiting in the lobby at 4:30, standing near the windows with his coat over one arm. He looked up when she came through security. How was it? Annie thought about the wrong school code, Priya apologizing, Marcia's tuna crackers, the man who called her a project, Daniel correcting him without looking at her like she should be grateful. It was work, she said. Richard smiled slightly. That sounds promising. On the drive home, she told him about the files and the timesheet. She did not tell him right away about the man from another department. Richard waited. He had begun to understand that Annie often reached the hardest part after circling the easier ones. Finally, she said, Somebody called me your project. Richard's hands tightened on the wheel. Who? Daniel handled it. I asked who. Mr. Whitmore. He glanced at her. If you go after every person who says something, I'll never know if I can stand in a room on my own. Richard let that sit. You're right. She looked surprised. I don't like it, he added. But you're right. At the house, Mrs. Helen was making meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Annie went upstairs to change, then stopped in the blue room doorway. The suitcase still sat on the chair. For the first time, she did not touch it before setting down her folder. She noticed that after she did it, at dinner, Richard asked what she had learned. Annie cut a small piece of meatloaf. That paperwork can hurt people if you treat it like paper. Grace, who had come by with banking forms, lifted her glass. Finally, someone in this family understands my religion. Mrs. Helen snorted. Your religion charges by the hour. Annie laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, brief but clear. Everyone heard it. No one made too much of it. Later, she sat in the library with the copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God open on her lap, though she had read the same paragraph 3 times. Richard passed the doorway and paused. You need anything? Annie looked up. No, thank you. He started to leave. Richard? It was the first time she had used his name without being corrected into it. He turned back carefully, as if sudden movement might scare the word away. Yes? Do you think people ever stop seeing what they decided you were? Richard thought before answering. Some do, some don't. The trick is not handing your whole life to the ones who don't. Annie looked down at the book. That sounds hard. It is. Then why call it a trick? Because older people like to make hard things sound clever after they survive them. She smiled at that. When she went upstairs, she placed her work badge in the top drawer beside her documents. The suitcase remained on the chair by the window. Not forgotten. Not gone. Just no longer the first thing her hand reached for. Outside, freezing rain softened into snow. Inside, Annie turned off the lamp and lay under the quilt instead of on top of it. Her shoes were beside the bed, toes no longer pointing toward the door. By the second week at Whitmore Foundation, Annie had learned which elevator arrived fastest, which printer jammed when fed too many envelopes, and which employees said good morning because they meant it. She had also learned that office work had its own kind of weather. Some days moved cleanly from one task to the next. Other days changed without warning because a donor called, a deadline shifted, or a student's missing form meant rent money might not arrive on time. Daniel did not praise much, but he trusted in visible ways. He gave Annie files no one would hand to a careless person. Marcia asked her to review addresses before donor packets went out. Priya let her sit in on a call with a community center director who needed emergency winter coats for students. Annie took notes in a yellow pad Richard had given her. She wrote everything down, not because she feared forgetting, though she did, because writing made the work feel real. On Friday afternoon, Daniel stopped beside her desk with a folder in one hand. You got 5 minutes? Annie saved the spreadsheet. Yes. Conference room. Her stomach tightened before she could stop it. Conference rooms still felt like places where adults decided things after asking only half the questions. Daniel noticed. It's not bad. That usually means it's complicated. That's a fair description of most adult life. Inside the conference room, Grace was already there, sitting beside a woman from communications named Lori, who wore silver earrings and had a laptop open in front of her. Richard stood near the window, one hand in his pocket. When Annie entered, he did not speak first. He had learned to let other people explain when the matter belonged to them. Lori smiled. Hi, Annie. I'm Lori Matthews. I handle internal communications for the foundation. Daniel and Grace said you prefer straight talk, so I'll give you that. Annie sat carefully. Okay, we're preparing the spring scholarship bulletin. It goes to staff, donors, community partners, and a few local education outlets. We'd like to include you as one of the incoming Whitmore Foundation scholars, if you're comfortable. Annie glanced at Daniel. Include me how? Photo, short profile, your school, your intended area of study, maybe a quote about work and college. Nothing about your family situation, unless you choose to share it, and you don't have to. Grace added, I'll review anything before it goes out. You can say no. Annie looked down at her hands. Part of her wanted to disappear under the table. Another part smaller but newly awake. Wondered what it would feel like to be seen for something other than being thrown away. Richard spoke then, quiet. This is not a payment for help. It's not a favor to me. The bulletin features students every cycle. You qualify on your own. Lori turned the laptop toward Annie. On the screen were past profiles. A young man headed to nursing school. A mother returning to community college. Twins accepted into engineering programs. Their stories were brief, respectful, ordinary, in a way that calmed her. Annie read them twice. I don't want anyone saying I was homeless, she said. Then we don't say it, Lori replied. I don't want my stepmother's name anywhere. It won't be. I don't want people looking at me like I'm some sad thing Mr. Whitmore picked up. Daniel leaned back. Then give them something else to look at. Annie looked at him. Your work, he said. Your grades. Your plans. Your name. That stayed with her. The photo was taken the following Tuesday in the foundation office, not Richard's private floor. Annie wore the navy blazer Mrs. Helen had altered at the sleeves and a white blouse Grace insisted looked professional but not stiff. Her mother's blue scarf was folded around her ponytail. Lori asked if Annie wanted Richard in the photo. Annie hesitated. You don't have to, Richard said. I know. She thought about the bus station. The old bench. The man with the duffel. Richard standing up and telling him to leave. She thought about the house, the documents, the glass on the kitchen floor, the first day at the office. You can be in one, she said. But I want one by myself too. Richard nodded. That sounds right. The solo photo showed Annie beside the scholarship office window, holding a folder, her shoulders straight. In the second photo, Richard stood beside her but not too close. He was not touching her shoulder, not presenting her like proof of his goodness. They simply stood in the same frame, two people connected by a decision neither of them fully understood yet. Lori sent the draft 2 days later. Whitmore Foundation scholar begins internship before college. Annie Johnson, a Cleveland high school senior admitted to Lake Erie State University, has joined the Whitmore Foundation Scholarship Office as a student intern while preparing to study business administration. Johnson balances school, work experience, and community-focused career goals. I want to understand how resources reach people, she said, and why some people are always told to wait. Annie read the quote 3 times. She had said it in the interview, not thinking it would be used. Seeing it there made her chest feel tight. Is it too much? She asked Grace. Grace adjusted her glasses. It is honest without being reckless. Mrs. Helen read it at the kitchen counter and tapped the paper with one finger. That last line has teeth. Is that bad? No, some sentences ought to bite. Richard read it after dinner. He looked at the photo longer than the text. You look like yourself, he said. Annie did not know why that felt like praise, but it did. The bulletin went out on a Monday morning. At first, nothing happened. Marcia brought a printed copy and pinned it to the office board near the coffee machine. Priya gave Annie a thumbs up from across the room. Ken said, good quote, then returned to arguing with a spreadsheet. Around lunch, Mrs. Parker called. I saw the bulletin, she said. I printed it for my classroom. You didn't have to do that. I know. I wanted to. Annie lowered her voice. Did it sound like bragging? Annie, telling the truth about earning something is not bragging. It only feels that way when you've been trained to make yourself small. After school, Mr. Ray taped a copy behind the diner counter beside the health inspection grade. When Annie came in for her Saturday shift, he pointed at it with a spatula. Customer asked if that was you. I said, no, that's our regional vice president of wiping tables. Annie laughed. Mr. Ray, what? You want me to get sentimental? I got eggs burning. For a few days, the attention stayed small and manageable. A teacher congratulated her in the hallway. A woman from church left a message with Mrs. Parker. Daniel gave her more applicant follow-up work. Richard did not make a speech. Mrs. Helen bought a small cheesecake and claimed it was on sale. Then the local education page picked up the bulletin. By Thursday evening, Annie's photo had been shared on Facebook under a headline that made her stomach drop. Local student overcomes hardship with help from Whitmore Foundation. The article was not cruel. It did not name Marilyn. It did not say where Annie had been found, but it said enough. A Cleveland student, unexpected housing instability, mentorship, Whitmore, scholarship, internship. Annie read the comments until Grace took the phone from her hand. No, I just want to know what people are saying. That is how people invite strangers into their nervous system. Richard looked over from the stove, where Mrs. Helen had forced him to stir chili. Anything bad? Grace gave him a look. Do not join her in poor choices. But Annie had already seen some of them. Good for her. Wonderful program. Mr. Whitmore does so much for this city. What's the real story? Girls don't end up in these situations for no reason. Must be nice to have a billionaire fix your problems. She went quiet after that. Upstairs, she opened the drawer where her documents were kept and touched each one, as if making sure the article had not loosened them. Then she looked at the suitcase by the window. For the first time in days, she wanted to pull it closer to the bed. She did not. Across town, Marilyn Carter sat at her kitchen table with her phone in one hand and a cigarette burning untouched in an ashtray. She had seen the article because a neighbor sent it with one line, "Isn't this Frank's Annie?" Marilyn read it once, then again. In the photo, Annie wore a blazer Marilyn had never bought her, hair tied back with that blue scarf Lily had no business giving away. She stood in a clean office beside Richard Whitmore, whose name Marilyn knew the way everybody in Cleveland knew names attached to buildings and money. Frank sat in the living room, sober for the moment, watching a game with the sound low. Lily colored at the far end of the table. Marilyn zoomed in on the photo until Annie's face filled the screen. "Well," she said. Lily looked up. "What?" Marilyn locked the phone and smiled in a way that made Lily look back down fast. "Your sister's been busy," Frank called from the living room. "What about Annie?" Marilyn did not answer him. Her anger came first, sharp and familiar. Annie had no right to stand there looking composed, no right to let people think she had risen from anything. But beneath the anger, another thought began to form. Whitmore Foundation, scholarship, internship. Richard Whitmore. Money had a way of changing the meaning of family. Marilyn had always believed that. If Annie had found her way near that kind of money, then Annie had found something the family could use. Marilyn picked up her phone again and opened the article. This time, she did not read Annie's quote. She looked for the address of the foundation office. Marilyn arrived at Whitmore Holdings the following Tuesday just before noon, when the lobby was busiest and people had less patience for quiet questions. She had dressed for being believed. Cream coat, low heels, small gold earrings, hair smoothed back, lipstick soft enough to look maternal. Lily stood beside her in a pink jacket, holding a stuffed rabbit she was too old to need but too nervous to leave behind. At the front desk, Marilyn leaned forward with a smile that had worked on school secretaries, neighbors, and Frank before the drinking got bad. "I'm here to see Annie Johnson," she said. "I'm her mother." The receptionist looked at the visitor screen. "Do you have an appointment? She'll want to see me." Marilyn lowered her voice, adding a tremble she had practiced in the car. "There's been a family misunderstanding. We've been worried sick." Lily looked at the marble floor. The receptionist's expression changed, not into sympathy exactly, but caution. One moment. Upstairs, Annie was in the file room with Marcia, sorting scholarship applications by county, when Daniel appeared at the door. "Annie." She looked up. "Did I put something in the wrong tray?" "No." His voice was controlled. "There's someone in the lobby asking for you, Marilyn Carter." The folder in Annie's hand bent under her fingers. Marcia stopped sorting. Daniel stepped closer. "You don't have to go down. I can tell security to ask her to leave." Annie's first instinct was to say yes. Send her away, lock the elevator, make the building a wall. But then she thought of Lily standing beside Marilyn, because Marilyn would bring Lily if she wanted Annie soft. "Is Lily with her?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Annie closed her eyes for 1 second. "I'll go. Not alone." "I know." Daniel walked beside her to the elevator. Richard was not in the building. He was across town at a zoning meeting. Grace was in court. That should have made Annie feel smaller, but Daniel's presence was steady, and when the elevator doors opened, Marcia had somehow appeared behind them with a file box in her arms. "What?" Marcia said when Daniel looked at her. "I needed copies." "You don't have any papers in that box," Daniel said. "I said copies. I didn't say of what." Annie almost laughed, but the sound died when she saw Marilyn in the lobby. For a moment, her stepmother looked exactly like she had on Sundays years ago, greeting women at church, touching Annie's shoulder just enough for people to see. Then Marilyn turned and spread her arms. "Annie, baby." Annie stopped 3 feet away. "Don't." Marilyn's arms lowered slowly, but the hurt expression remained. I deserve that. I know I do. Things got ugly that night. I said things I shouldn't have said. Lily stood half behind her mother, eyes fixed on Annie. Annie looked at her. Hi, Lily. Hi, Lily whispered. Marilyn brushed Lily's shoulder. She's missed you so much. We all have. Daniel stood slightly behind Annie, close enough to be clear. Marilyn glanced at him. This is family business. Daniel's face did not change. Then you shouldn't have brought it to her workplace. The smile thinned before Marilyn repaired it. I only came because she won't answer. Her father's been beside himself. Annie felt that one land. Dad hasn't called me. He's ashamed. He knows my number. He's sick, Annie. Marilyn's voice softened. The drinking's gotten worse since you left. Rent's behind. Lily needs things. We're trying to hold the house together. Annie hated that part of her still reacted to the word house. Not home. House. The place where her mother's picture had once hung in the hallway. The place where Frank used to make pancakes on Saturdays before grief took the stove from him. I'm sorry Lily needs things, Annie said. But I can't help you. Marilyn's eyebrows lifted. Can't or won't? Daniel took half a step forward. Annie lifted her hand slightly. She wanted to answer for herself. I'm still in school, Annie said. I'm working. I don't have money to give you. Marilyn looked around the lobby, the security desk, the elevators, the wall with Whitmore Holdings written in brushed steel. You're standing in a Billionaire's building, wearing clothes you didn't own a month ago, and you're telling me you can't help your own family? Heat rose in Annie's face. A man passing with a coffee slowed down. Marcia shifted the empty file box against her hip and stared him into walking again. My clothes aren't the point, Annie said. No, I suppose not. The point is, you let strangers think we threw you into the street, like trash. Marilyn's voice lowered, sharper now. You know how that looks? Annie said nothing. Marilyn leaned in just enough for only Annie and Daniel to hear. I raised you after your mama died. I fed you. I kept a roof over your head. Now you're letting that rich man's people use you for a sad little scholarship story. Daniel said, careful. Marilyn looked at him. Excuse me? You heard me. Annie's hands had gone cold. What do you want? Marilyn's face changed again. It was small, almost invisible, but Annie knew it. The mask slipped from sorrow into business. We need temporary help, that's all. 5,000 would catch up the rent and bills. 10 would give your father a chance to get treatment without us losing the house. $10,000? Annie said. Don't say it like that. Mr. Whitmore spends more than that on lunch meetings. He doesn't owe you anything. No, but maybe he owes you, and maybe you owe us. Lily's eyes filled with tears. Mom, can we go? Marilyn tightened her hand on Lily's shoulder. In a minute. Annie saw it then, not for the first time but with new clarity. Marilyn had not come because Frank was sick or Lily was needy. She had come because Annie's picture had appeared beside money. I'm not asking him for money, Annie said. Marilyn's smile disappeared. Think carefully, she said. People are already asking questions online. Girl like you, man like him, big house, private cars. You really want folks filling in the blanks themselves? The words made Annie's stomach turn. Daniel's face hardened. That's enough, he said. Marilyn ignored him. I can tell reporters plenty. How you ran off after stealing. How you always lied when you didn't get your way. How Mr. Whitmore took you in without asking your father a thing. I'm not a child, Annie said, but her voice shook. No, Marilyn said. You're old enough to know what a nasty story can do. A security officer had begun moving toward them. Marcia set the file box down with more force than necessary. Daniel stepped between Marilyn and Annie. Mrs. Carter, you're leaving now. Marilyn's eyes flashed. Don't you put your hands on me. Nobody touched you. Security will escort you out. Marilyn looked past him at Annie. You're making a mistake. Annie wanted to say something strong. She wanted to say Marilyn had no power here, that the lobby was not her living room, that the people watching now were not the same neighbors who smiled and looked away. But her throat had closed. Lily tugged her mother's sleeve. Please. Marilyn turned sharply. Stop pulling on me. Annie moved before she thought. Don't talk to her like that. The lobby quieted in a way Annie felt before she noticed. Marilyn stared at her. What did you say? Annie's hands were shaking. But she kept her eyes on Lily. Don't talk to her like that. For 1 second, Marilyn looked ready to step forward. Then she remembered where she was. She remembered the cameras, the security desk. Daniel, Marcia, the name on the wall behind them. She smiled, but it no longer fit. "We'll talk again," Marilyn said. "No," Daniel replied. "You'll contact Miss Johnson through counsel if she permits it. Otherwise, you won't contact her at all." Marilyn gave a small laugh. "Counsel, listen to you people." Security arrived beside her. Marilyn lifted her chin, took Lily's hand, and walked toward the doors as if leaving had been her idea. Lily looked back once. Annie raised her hand a little. Lily did not wave, but her fingers moved against the rabbit's ear. When the doors closed behind them, the lobby noise returned too quickly. Shoes on stone, elevator chimes, a phone ringing at reception. Annie stood still, breathing like she had been running. Daniel turned to her. "Come upstairs. I'm Fina." "No, you're upright. Different thing." Marcia picked up her empty file box. "I'm coming too." In the elevator, Annie stared at the numbers. No one spoke until they reached the 12th floor. Daniel led her into the small conference room and closed the door. Marcia brought water. Annie held the cup but did not drink. "I should have handled that better," Annie said. Daniel sat across from her. "You handled it." She made everyone look. She chose the lobby because she wanted everyone to look. Annie's eyes burned. "She'll do it. She'll say things." Daniel nodded. "Probably." That honesty helped more than comfort would have. Marcia pushed the tissue box toward Annie. "Let her talk. People like that always think noise is proof. It isn't." Annie wiped her cheek fast. "I hate that she can still make me feel like I did something wrong." Daniel leaned forward. "That feeling is old training. It is not evidence." Annie looked at him. He stood. "I'm calling Richard." Then Grace. "No," Annie said quickly. "Richard's in a meeting. He can survive being interrupted." "I don't want to be the reason." Daniel cut her off, not unkindly. "Annie, this is exactly the kind of thing people need to know before it grows teeth." Marcia nodded. "And it already has gums?" Despite everything, Annie let out a weak laugh. Daniel stepped into the hall with his phone. Through the glass, Annie saw him speaking, one hand on his hip, expression controlled but firm. Across town, Richard left the zoning meeting before the final vote. Grace answered from the courthouse hallway and asked only 3 questions before saying she would come straight over. Annie sat in the conference room, hands around the water cup, staring at her reflection in the dark screen on the wall. In it, she saw the blazer, the blue scarf, the office badge, the girl from the bulletin board. Underneath, she still saw the girl at the bus station with both arms around a suitcase. For a moment, they looked like 2 different people. Then Annie understood they were not. They were both her, and Marilyn had just reminded her that being seen did not only bring congratulations. Sometimes it brought the past to the front desk, dressed nicely, asking for money. Truckee Richard arrived. Grace was already in Daniel's office with a legal pad open and 3 pages of notes. She did not waste time asking Annie how she felt first. She asked what had happened, in order, without guessing, without filling gaps. "What time did Marilyn arrive?" "About noon." "Did she touch you?" "No." "Did she threaten you?" "She said people online were already asking questions. She said she could tell reporters I stole money, and that Mr. Whitmore took me in without asking my father." Grace wrote every word. "Anything else?" "She asked for $10,000. Daniel added quietly, "In front of witnesses." Grace nodded. "Good." Annie frowned. "Good?" "Not what she said. That she said it where other people heard it." 20 minutes later, Richard walked into the conference room still wearing the same overcoat from his meeting. He looked first at Annie, making sure she was standing, breathing, unhurt. Only then did he ask Daniel what had happened. Daniel handed him the written summary. Richard read it without interruption. By the end, his jaw had tightened enough for Grace to notice. "Don't," she said. He looked up. "Don't make decisions angry." "I'm not angry." Grace gave him a look that had probably worked since they were children. "You're furious." Richard folded the paper once. "She brought Lily." "Yes." "She used the child." "Yes." "She threatened Annie." "Yes." "And asked for money." "Yes." He looked at Annie. "You don't owe anyone an answer," he said quietly. Annie looked down. "I know." "No," Richard replied. "You understand the words. I need you to believe them." Grace closed her folder. I'll prepare a formal notice instructing Marilyn Carter not to contact Annie directly. If she ignores it, we escalate. Richard asked, can she contact the press? She can. Anyone can. Truth and lies travel under the same postage. Annie stared at the table. What if people believe her? Grace answered before Richard could. Some will. The honesty hurt. Grace continued. Some people believe the first story they hear because it saves them the trouble of thinking. You cannot organize your life around those people. Richard finally sat down across from Annie. She made one mistake. What? She thought fear still belongs to her. Annie did not answer. Back at the house that evening, Mrs. Helen had already heard enough from Grace to know not to ask questions at the dinner table. She simply placed roast chicken in the middle, passed the potatoes, and told Richard, if you poke at the child all through supper, I'll make you eat in the garage. Richard raised both hands. Understood. For a while, the only sounds were forks and plates. Then Mrs. Helen looked at Annie. You know what I noticed this morning? Annie shook her head. You left your suitcase upstairs when you came down. Annie blinked. I did? You did. She had not even realized it. Mrs. Helen smiled into her tea. Little things count. After dinner, Annie went upstairs to check anyway. The suitcase was still beside the chair. Nothing had happened because she left it alone for an hour. She stood there looking at it longer than necessary. A knock came at the half-open door. Richard stood in the hallway. I'm not interrupting, am I? No. He looked at the suitcase, then at Annie. When I lost Margaret, he said quietly, I kept her coat in the front closet for almost 2 years. Annie looked at him. I told myself I might need it there. But you didn't. No. What happened? One day Helen sent it to the cleaners without asking me. Annie looked horrified. She did? Richard nodded. I was angry for about 3 hours. And then? She brought it back. Annie frowned. She wasn't trying to take it away, Richard said. She was trying to remind me that loving someone and freezing time are different things. Silence settled between them. Finally, Annie looked at the suitcase. I don't know what happens if I stop holding on so tightly. Richard considered that. I don't either. That doesn't scare you? It does. Then how do you keep going? He smiled faintly. I usually go anyway and get scared while moving. That earned the smallest laugh. The next morning, Grace called before breakfast. Richard. Yes? I've got something. What? A reporter contacted the Foundation Communications office yesterday asking whether it's true you personally adopted a homeless girl after finding her on the street. Richard rubbed his forehead. No. I know. Lori didn't answer. She referred everything through legal. Who contacted them? Local online outlet. Small, but stories spread. Richard glanced toward Annie, who was helping Mrs. Helen set plates on the table. She doesn't know yet. She should. After breakfast, Grace came over in person. She explained everything plainly. Annie sat very still. So they're writing about me again? Possibly. What if they print Marilyn's version? They might. What if colleges see it? Grace slid a folder across the table. Then they also see this. Inside were copies of her acceptance, recommendation letters, work verification from Mr. Ray, statements from Mrs. Parker, internship records, scholarship documents, and a notarized timeline Grace had already assembled. Annie looked up. You made all this? Grace nodded. When people throw mud, don't answer with more mud. Answer with records. Mrs. Helen looked pleased. I like that woman. Richard smiled. You've known her your whole life. I still like her. Just before noon, Lori from communications called Richard's office. Richard? Yes. You should probably come downstairs. Why? A visitor. Marilyn? No. Who? A man named Frank Johnson. Richard stood. Is Annie with you? No. She's upstairs filing donor packets. What does Frank want? Lori hesitated. He says he isn't here for money. Richard was already reaching for his coat. And? He says he wants to apologize to his daughter. Upstairs, Annie was carefully placing labels onto envelopes when Daniel appeared again. His expression was different this time. Not guarded. Thoughtful. Annie. She looked up. Your father is downstairs. Everything in her hands stopped moving. Daniel spoke gently. You don't have to see him. Annie stared at the unfinished envelope in front of her. After nearly 2 weeks of silence, after the bus station, after the front porch, after not one phone call, Frank Johnson had finally come. Not with Marilyn. Alone. and for reasons Annie could not yet read. Annie did not answer Daniel right away. She looked at the envelope in her hand, at the label she had placed crooked across the corner, and tried to make her fingers let go. "My father?" she asked, though she had heard him. Daniel nodded. "He's in the lobby. Richard and Grace are with him. Marilyn is not there." That last sentence mattered. Annie hated that it mattered so much. "Is he drunk?" "No." She stood too quickly, then sat back down. "I don't know if I want to see him. You don't have to decide fast." In Marilyn's house, decisions had always come with a countdown. Answer now, move now, apologize now, get out now. Daniel waited beside the desk, as if waiting were a normal thing to give someone. Annie looked toward the window. The city below was gray with winter, cars moving in slow lines between buildings. Somewhere down there, her father had walked into this place, sober, alone, carrying whatever shame had finally become heavier than his fear. "I'll see him," she said, "but not alone." "Good." Frank Johnson looked smaller in the Whitmore lobby than he had in Annie's memories. He wore his brown work jacket, the zipper half stuck, and a knit cap twisted in both hands. His face was freshly shaved but tired, the skin under his eyes loose and dark. He stood near the security desk as if he expected someone to ask him to leave. Richard stood a few feet away. Grace had her folder against her chest. Neither of them spoke when Annie stepped out of the elevator. Frank saw her and seemed to forget how to breathe. "Annie," he said. She stopped beside Grace. "Hi, Dad." The word Dad came out by habit, and it hurt both of them. Frank looked at her blazer, her badge, the blue scarf in her hair. His eyes filled, but Annie did not move toward him. "I didn't come to make you come home," he said quickly. "I need you to know that." Grace's posture eased by 1 inch. Frank continued, "I didn't come for money either." Annie held her hands together. "Then why are you here?" He looked down at the cap in his hands. "Because I remember enough." The lobby noise seemed to pull back. Frank swallowed. "That night, I kept telling myself I was too drunk to know what was happening. But that's not the truth. I knew enough to hear her call you a thief. I knew enough to see the suitcase. I knew enough to know you were looking at me." Annie's eyes burned. She refused to wipe them. "You didn't stand up," she said. "No. You told me not to make it worse." "I did." She waited for excuses. Grief. Alcohol. Bills. Marilyn's temper. The kind of broken explanations adults used when they wanted the wound to sound accidental. Frank gave none. "I failed you," he said. "Not just that night." Annie looked away first. Richard glanced at Grace, then toward a small seating area off the lobby. "Would you like somewhere private but visible?" Annie nodded. They moved to a corner with chairs near the windows. Richard and Grace stayed close enough to be seen, far enough not to fill the space. Daniel remained near the elevator with his arms folded. Frank sat across from Annie but kept his knees angled away, as though giving her an exit. "I found the notebook," he said. Annie looked at him. "What notebook?" "The one Marilyn missed. Under the loose board in your closet, the old one, from when you were little." Annie remembered it slowly, a purple notebook with silver stars, where she used to write letters to her mother after the funeral. She had hidden it years ago and forgotten. Frank's voice shook. "You wrote, 'Daddy sleeps in the chair now. I think he is sadder than me, so I try not to need anything.'" Annie closed her eyes. "I read that," Frank said, "and I sat on the floor like an old fool. Because you were a child, and you were already making yourself smaller so I could fall apart." Annie opened her eyes. "Why now?" Frank nodded like he deserved the question. "Because Lily told me." Annie stiffened. "She told me Marilyn put the money in your bag." She cried herself sick saying it. Marilyn told her to keep quiet. His face tightened. "I should have known without an 8-year-old telling me." "Yes," Annie said. "I know." For a moment, all Annie could hear was the low murmur of the lobby. The elevator bell. Someone laughing near the revolving doors. "Is Lily okay?" Annie asked. Frank rubbed his eyes. "She's scared. Marilyn's angry all the time. But Lily's with my sister right now. I took her there this morning." Annie stared at him. "Aunt Rose? She said I should have come to her years ago." "She's right. Does Marilyn know?" "Yes." "And?" "She broke a plate. Said I was choosing you over my family." Frank gave a tired, bitter breath. I told her you are my family. Annie looked down at her hands. Those were the words she had needed on the night it mattered most. Hearing them now did not fix the past. It only showed her the shape of what had been missing. Frank leaned forward, then stopped himself. I'm going to treatment. Annie looked up. I called a place in Akron. 30 days to start. Rose said she'll help with Lily while I'm gone. I don't expect you to believe me, because I said it. I just wanted you to know I'm going. When? Tomorrow morning. The answer came fast enough to be real. Annie's throat tightened. Are you doing it because Marilyn got exposed? No. He looked at her. I'm doing it because I saw my daughter on a bulletin board and realized strangers had done more for her in 2 weeks than I had done in years. Annie flinched at the truth of it. Frank saw and nodded. I'm sorry. That was ugly to say. It was true. Still ugly. She almost smiled. Almost. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I brought this. It's not money. Annie did not take it right away. Frank placed it on the low table between them. Your mama's recipe cards. Marilyn had them in a drawer with old coupons. I thought you might want them. Annie stared at the envelope. Her mother's handwriting. Cornbread dressing, peach cobbler, Sunday chicken. Little instructions that had survived where the woman had not. She picked it up carefully. Thank you, she said. Frank's face crumpled, but he held himself together. I don't forgive you, Annie said. He nodded. I know. I don't know when I will. I know that too. And I'm not coming back. I'm not asking. She looked at him then, really looked. The father she loved was still somewhere inside the man who had failed her, but she no longer believed love required her to stand in the wreckage with him. Frank stood slowly. I'll give Grace the treatment center information, he said. If you ever want to know how I'm doing, she can tell you. If you don't, that's your right. Annie held the envelope against her lap. At the elevator, Frank turned back once. You look like your mama, he said. Annie's eyes filled again. People always say that. She would have liked seeing you in that building upstairs. The elevator opened. Frank stepped inside. This time, when the doors closed, Annie was not the one being left outside. Grace came over first. Do you need to leave for the day? Annie shook her head. Richard studied her face. You don't have to prove anything by going back upstairs. I know. Do you? She looked at the envelope in her hands, then at the elevator doors. No, she said, but I want to go back anyway. Daniel walked with her to the elevator. You sure? I have labels to fix. That one was crooked. I noticed. Good. Standards remain. When Annie returned to her desk, the file tray was still there, the computer still open, the crooked label waiting like a small, ordinary problem. She peeled it off and placed a new one straight. At lunch, she opened the envelope in the break room with Mrs. Helen on the phone and Grace sitting beside her. The recipe card smelled faintly of paper and cinnamon. On the peach cobbler card, her mother had written in the corner, Annie likes extra crust. Annie laughed once, then cried into a napkin while Grace pretended to read emails, and Mrs. Helen said through the speaker, extra crust is correct. Your mother had sense. That evening, Annie placed the recipe cards beside the photograph and the blue scarf. The suitcase remained by the window, but now it held more than proof she had been pushed out. It held things that had found their way back. Downstairs, Richard sat alone in the kitchen after everyone had gone quiet. He thought of Frank's face, Annie's voice, the way forgiveness had not been handed out like a polite favor. It made him respect her more. Some people thought mercy meant opening every door again. Annie was learning that sometimes mercy meant locking one door gently, then walking toward another with your own name on the key. The story about Frank reached Marilyn before dinner. Aunt Rose did not call her. Frank did not call her. Lily did not tell her. Marilyn learned the way she preferred to learn things, by forcing them out of people who were too tired to fight. She drove to Rose's apartment that evening, found the door chained, and shouted through the gap until a neighbor stepped into the hall with a phone in his hand. Call whoever you want, Marilyn snapped at him. This is my family, Rose answered from behind the door. Not tonight, it isn't. Marilyn stood in the hallway with her purse over one shoulder, breathing hard. Lily was inside. Frank was leaving for treatment in the morning. Annie was in Richard Whitmore's building, wearing a badge and being treated like someone worth protecting. One by one, the doors Marilyn had controlled were closing. So she did what she knew how to do. She found another door. By the next morning, 2 local pages had received the same message from an account under Marilyn's maiden name. It was not written like a rant. Marilyn knew better than that. It was polished, wounded, careful, a struggling stepmother, a troubled young woman, a wealthy man who had interfered, a family being smeared by people with money. Questions about why a powerful bachelor had taken a young woman into his home. Questions about whether the foundation gave scholarships based on merit or personal sympathy. Grace saw the post before Annie did. She was in Richard's kitchen at 7:30 with her laptop open and her jaw set. Richard read over her shoulder. "How far has it gone?" "Small so far. Shared 42 times. That's enough to become a brush fire by lunch." Mrs. Helen set a coffee mug down harder than necessary. "That woman writes like a church bulletin got into a knife fight." Richard looked toward the stairway. "Annie?" "Not yet," Grace said, "but we tell her before someone else does." Annie came down 10 minutes later in her work clothes, carrying the blue folder Daniel had given her. She saw their faces and stopped. "What happened?" Grace turned the laptop toward her. Marilyn posted something. Annie did not sit. She read standing up. Her face changed only once, at the line about Richard. "She's making it sound dirty," Annie said. Richard's voice was quiet. "I know." Annie looked at him. "I'm sorry." "No. She's doing it because of me. She's doing it because of her," Richard said, sharper than he meant to. He softened his voice. "Annie, look at me. You did not write that." Annie's eyes stayed on the screen. "People will believe it." "Some will," Grace said. Annie let out a small breath. "You always say the worst part like it's weather. It helps to name rain before choosing a coat." Mrs. Helen folded her arms. "And today we're choosing a good one." Grace clicked open another document. "We have 2 options. Ignore it publicly while preserving evidence, or release a short statement through the foundation. No personal details, no fight, just facts." Richard looked at Annie. "Your choice matters here." "My choice? It's your life in that post," he said. "Not just my name." Annie finally sat. She read Marilyn's words again, slower this time. Marilyn had called her unstable, ungrateful, easily influenced. She had not called her thief in the post, but the shape of the accusation was there, waiting between lines. "What would the statement say?" Annie asked. Grace read from her draft. "Whitmore Foundation scholarship recipients are reviewed through established procedures. Annie Johnson is an adult student admitted to Lake Erie State University and employed as a paid intern under standard supervision. Any suggestion of improper conduct is false. We will not comment further on a private individual's family matters." Annie looked at Richard. "Will that protect you?" "It will help." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "I've survived worse than gossip." "Have you?" The question hit him harder than she knew. Richard looked away first. In his world, reputation was not vanity. It was leverage, trust, contracts, staff, boards, donors, people whose jobs depended on the building staying upright. Annie understood enough now to know Marilyn was throwing stones at more than one window. Grace closed the laptop halfway. "Annie, the truth is this may be uncomfortable for him. It may be uncomfortable for the foundation. That does not make it your fault." Annie nodded, but the old training was loud. At the office, the post had already made its rounds. People tried not to look like they knew. That was almost worse. The lobby receptionist smiled too kindly. A man in the elevator stopped talking when Annie stepped in. On the 12th floor, Marcia met her at the entrance to the scholarship office with a stack of mail. "If anyone asks you foolish questions," Marcia said, "send them to me. I'm old enough to be rude for sport." Priya looked up from her desk. "Or me. I'm younger, but motivated." Ken raised his coffee. "I can be cold and procedural." Daniel came out of his office. "All of you have work." Marcia handed Annie the mail. "We are working on workplace culture." Annie managed a weak smile. By 10, the foundation statement was posted. By noon, comments split into camps. Some defended Annie. Some defended Marilyn without knowing her. Some only wanted to discuss Richard. By 2, Lori from communications had fielded 3 calls. Grace preserved screenshots, sent a cease and desist letter to Marilyn, and told Richard not to call anyone personally. Richard called no one. He came to the 12th floor instead. Daniel saw him and shook his head. "If you're here to loom, Loom somewhere useful. Richard looked toward Annie's desk. She was entering data, shoulders rigid. I'm checking on my foundation. You have 12 floors to check. Daniel. Daniel lowered his voice. She's trying to work. Let her. Richard stopped. Through the glass partition, he watched Annie correct an address on a student file, then attach a note about missing income verification. Her hands moved carefully. She was holding herself together with tasks. He understood that better than anyone. At 4, Annie brought Daniel a completed batch of files. Good, he said after reviewing them. That's it? What were you hoping for? I don't know. A disaster rating. You did your job while people were being stupid. That's not a disaster. She looked toward Richard, who stood by the window pretending to read a donor plaque. I should go talk to him. Daniel nodded. Probably. Richard turned before she reached him. I didn't want to interrupt you, he said. You did a little. His mouth twitched. Fair. They stood near the window, both looking down at the street. Are you angry? Annie asked. Yes. At me? No. She believed him more quickly than she expected, and that frightened her. I was thinking, she said. Marilyn keeps telling stories because she thinks nobody will put all the pieces together. Maybe we should. Richard looked at her. Not online, Annie added. Not like her, but with Grace. Mr. Ray, Mrs. Parker, Daniel, Lily, if she's safe. The money, the texts, everything. Put it somewhere official. Richard studied her face. You want to build the record. Grace said paperwork saves lives. She'll be unbearable when she hears you quote her. I know. For the first time all day, Richard smiled. The formal meeting was set for Friday in a conference room on the 12th floor. Not a court. Not yet. But Grace wanted sworn statements ready if Marilyn escalated. Daniel arranged the room. Lori documented the foundation's process. Mr. Ray came in wearing his diner jacket, smelling faintly of coffee and grill smoke. Mrs. Parker arrived with a folder thick enough to make Grace look pleased. Aunt Rose brought Lily, with Frank's written permission from the treatment center intake office. Annie nearly cried when she saw Lily. Lily ran to her, then stopped short, looking back at Aunt Rose for permission. Annie knelt and opened her arms. Lily fell into them. I'm sorry, Lily whispered. You're not the one who should be. Grace let them have a minute, then began. Marilyn had been invited through council. No one expected her to come. She came anyway. She walked in 15 minutes late, face tight, coat buttoned to the throat. What is this supposed to be? Grace did not stand. A documented meeting regarding your recent public claims and direct threats toward Annie Johnson. Marilyn looked around the room. Her eyes landed on Lily. You brought my child into this? Aunt Rose stood. Frank gave permission. Sit down or leave. Marilyn pointed at Annie. Look at you. Got everybody performing for you now. Richard stood before Annie could speak. No, he said. You don't walk into this room and start with her. Marilyn laughed. There he is, the billionaire savior. Richard's voice cut through the room. Sit down, Mrs. Carter, or walk out. But if you stay, you will listen. The room went still. Marilyn sat. Grace began laying out the record. Annie's work schedule. Ray's statement. The tip money notebook. Mrs. Parker's college documents. Screenshots of Marilyn's threats. The lobby incident witnessed by Daniel and Marcia. The public post implying misconduct. Marilyn kept her face arranged until Lily began to cry. Grace looked at the child gently. Lily, you only speak if you want to. No one here is angry at you. Marilyn hissed. Lily, don't you dare. Richard's chair moved back. Do not raise your voice at another child in this building. Marilyn snapped toward him. She is my daughter, and she is frightened, Richard said. Lily wiped her face with both hands. Mom put the money in Annie's bag. Marilyn went white. Aunt Rose closed her eyes. Lily kept going, words tumbling now. She said Annie needed to leave before college made everything worse. She said Daddy wouldn't stop her if he drank enough. She told me if I said anything, Annie would hate me too. Annie covered her mouth. Marilyn stood. That is a lie. No, Annie said. Her own voice surprised her. She rose slowly, one hand resting on the back of the chair. You don't get to use that word anymore just because the truth finally sounds like someone else. Marilyn turned on her. After everything I gave you, Annie met her eyes. You didn't give me a home. You gave me a place to be afraid in. No one moved. For years, Marilyn had owned the rooms Annie stood in. The kitchen, the hallway, the porch. the space between accusation and apology. But this room did not belong to Marilyn. It belonged to the record, to witnesses, to the people who had decided not to look away. Richard looked at Annie then, and his voice was low but clear. I did not make Annie extraordinary. She already was. I only made sure hunger, cruelty, and lies didn't get the final word. Marilyn grabbed her purse. You'll regret this. Grace capped her pen. Put that in writing too, if you like. It saves me time. Marilyn left with security waiting outside the door. No one clapped. Real life did not do that. Lily cried into Aunt Rose's coat. Mr. Ray muttered something about needing to get back before the lunch rush. Mrs. Parker held Annie's hand for 3 seconds, then let go before it became too much. Annie sat down slowly. The room was quiet but not empty. For the first time, the truth had more witnesses than the lie. After Marilyn left, nobody rushed Annie out of the conference room. That mattered. All her life, after a storm, someone had always expected her to clean the floor, fix her face, and act like the roof had not just come off. Grace gathered the documents with slow hands. Daniel spoke quietly with security near the door. Mr. Ray checked his watch twice, then looked guilty for checking it at all. I got to get back, he said to Annie. Lunch crowd doesn't care about justice. Annie nodded. Thank you for coming. Ray shifted his cap in his hands. You ever need me to say it again, I'll say it louder. Mrs. Parker hugged Annie, but only after asking with her eyes. I'm proud of you, she said. I didn't do much. You stayed in the room. Some days that is much. Aunt Rose took Lily downstairs for hot chocolate from the lobby cafe. Lily had cried herself quiet, one hand tucked in Annie's before she left. Annie watched the elevator close on her little sister and felt the ache of wanting to protect someone from a house she had barely escaped herself. When the room finally emptied, Richard remained near the window. He did not speak until Annie sat down again with both hands flat on the table. You all right? No. He nodded. Fair answer. I thought it would feel better. The truth coming out? Yes. Sometimes it doesn't feel better right away. Sometimes it just stops the bleeding. Annie looked at the chair where Marilyn had sat. She still hates me. Richard's voice was quiet. That was never your burden to repair. Grace returned from the hallway. Marilyn has been escorted out. She was warned not to return without an appointment through counsel. Will she stop? Annie asked. Grace did not lie. Not because she suddenly found character, but she knows the cost is higher now. Annie let out a tired breath. That's something. It is. Richard walked her out through the side corridor instead of the main lobby. Not to hide her, he said, but to give her a choice about how many eyes she wanted on her. Annie chose the quieter way. That evening, Mrs. Helen made tomato soup and grilled cheese, a dinner simple enough for a day that had already demanded too much. Annie ate at the kitchen table in Richard's house with the blue scarf folded beside her plate. She had taken it out of her hair after the meeting because her head hurt. No one asked her to talk. Halfway through dinner, Grace's phone rang. She checked the screen and stepped into the hall. When she returned, her expression had changed. That was the treatment center, she said to Annie. Your father asked if I could pass along a message. Only if you want to hear it. Annie's spoon stopped. Richard looked at her, then looked away, giving her room. What did he say? Grace sat down. He said Lily is safe with Rose. He said he signed the 30-day intake papers. He said he watched the meeting statement that Rose recorded for him, with Lily's permission. She paused. He said, Tell Annie I heard what she said about home, and she was right. Annie stared at the soup until the surface blurred. Mrs. Helen placed a napkin near her hand without comment. Grace continued. He also said he won't contact you directly unless you ask. He doesn't want to make recovery another thing you have to manage. That sentence did something none of his apologies had done. It gave Annie a little space. He really said that? Yes. Annie nodded once. Okay. Richard waited until Grace left that night before finding Annie in the library. She had her mother's recipe cards spread across the small table. Peach cobbler, cornbread dressing, sweet potato pie, chicken with paprika, a grocery list written on the back of a church envelope. My mom had pretty handwriting, Annie said. She did. You didn't know her? No, Richard said. But I can see it. Annie touched the peach cobbler card. Frank brought these like it fixed something. Did he think it did? No. She looked up. That's the part I keep thinking about. He didn't ask me to forgive him. Marilyn always demanded forgiveness before she even finished hurting me. Richard sat in the chair across from her. People who are sorry make room. People who want control ask for the room back. Annie looked at him for a long moment. Did you forgive the person who caused your wife's accident? Richard's face changed. Annie straightened. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's all right. You don't have to answer. I know. He looked toward the dark window. It wasn't one person. A driver fell asleep. A company ignored safety complaints. A schedule was too tight because someone wanted costs down. A lot of hands. Not all of them visible. What happened? Lawsuit. Settlement. Policy changes no one outside the industry cared about. His mouth tightened. People told me that should bring closure. Did it? No, but it brought accountability. I learned not to confuse the two. Annie sat with that. Justice doesn't always make you feel whole, Richard said. Sometimes it just tells the world where the wound came from. Annie looked back at her mother's cards. That's still something. Yes. On Monday, Annie returned to work. No one applauded. No one gave speeches. Daniel handed her a stack of files and said, "County codes need checking." She almost laughed. "Good morning to you too." "It is a good morning, the codes are still wrong." Marcia had left a muffin on Annie's desk. Priya had stuck a note to her monitor. "Ask me about outreach calls when you're ready." Ken walked by and said, "The copier hates everyone equally today," which seemed to be his way of welcoming her back to normal life. Normal, Annie was learning, was not the absence of pain. It was the presence of small things that did not turn cruel. At noon, Lily called from Aunt Rose's phone. Annie took the call in an empty conference room. "Hi," Lily said. "Hey, are you mad at me?" Annie closed her eyes. "No, baby. Mom said you would be." Mom says a lot when she's scared of the truth. Lily was quiet. "Daddy went to the place." "I know. Are you coming to Aunt Rose's?" Annie looked through the glass wall at the office beyond. "Not today. But maybe soon. If Aunt Rose says it's okay. Can I keep talking to you?" "Yes." Lily breathed out. "Okay." After the call, Annie sat there for a minute longer. She had thought healing would mean cutting the past off like a bad limb. But Lily's voice reminded her that some parts of the past were still small, still frightened, still worth protecting. That night, Grace came by with formal papers. Marilyn had received the cease and desist letter. Rose had temporary care of Lily while Frank was in treatment. If Marilyn continued harassment, Grace would file for a protective order on Annie's behalf. "Do you want that now?" Grace asked. Annie thought about the lobby, the post, the conference room, Marilyn's face when Lily spoke. "Not yet," she said, "but I want everything ready." Grace looked pleased. "That is a legally satisfying answer." Mrs. Helen rolled her eyes. "You need hobbies." "I have hobbies. They're enforceable." Annie laughed, and this time she did not look surprised by the sound. Before bed, she took the suitcase from the chair and opened it on the floor. For weeks, it had held papers, clothes, the photograph, the scarf, the recipe cards. It had been storage, shield, warning, memory. She removed the documents and placed them in the lockbox Grace had given her. She put the recipe cards in the top drawer. The scarf stayed with her mother's photograph on the nightstand. Then she closed the suitcase. Not because she was leaving, because she was not. The next morning, Richard found it in the corner by the window instead of beside the bed. He noticed but said nothing until breakfast, when Annie came down in a gray sweater Mrs. Helen had found at a church charity sale. "You moved the suitcase," he said. Annie buttered her toast. A little counts. That's what Mrs. Helen said. Helen is annoyingly right about many things. From the stove, Helen said, "I heard that. You were meant to." Annie smiled into her plate. Outside, Cleveland carried on in its winter way. Buses sighing at curbs, workers scraping windshields, parents rushing children toward school doors, people making it through another morning because that was what mornings asked. Annie still had hard things ahead. College forms. Marilyn's anger. Frank's recovery, or failure at it. Lily's fear. Her own habits of apology and escape. But the truth had a file now. Witnesses, names, dates, a room where lies had not survived. And Annie had something else, quieter but stronger. She had begun to believe that staying did not always mean being trapped. Sometimes staying meant choosing the first safe place long enough to grow roots. By late spring, Annie's life had become a calendar. Monday and Wednesday afternoons at Whitmore Foundation. Tuesday evenings at Ray's Diner. Thursday, meetings with Mrs. Parker to finish the last scholarship forms. Saturdays split between diner shifts, laundry, and college checklists. Grace printed in color because, as she said, panic looks smaller when it has boxes to check. Annie still woke early, but not always in fear. Some mornings she woke because Mrs. Helen was singing badly in the kitchen, or because Richard had forgotten to turn off the hallway light after reading too late in the library. The blue room had changed without anyone announcing it. A stack of books sat on the chair where the suitcase used to be. Her work badge hung from the desk lamp. The suitcase had moved to the corner by the window, closed, with her mother's blue scarf folded on top when Annie did not wear it. Richard noticed all of it and said little. He had learned that some progress did not like being stared at. One Saturday in June, Annie came home from Ray's Diner with sore feet and a white envelope from Lake Erie State. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding it. Mrs. Helen turned from the stove. "That the housing one?" "I think so. Open it before I burn these onions from suspense." Richard lowered the book he was reading at the table. "Do you want privacy?" Annie shook her head, then opened the envelope with a butter knife because her hands were not steady enough to tear it cleanly. She read the first page twice. "I got dorm placement," she said. Mrs. Helen clapped once. "Good." Richard stood. "Where?" "Maple Hall, second floor, shared room." Annie kept reading. "Move. In is August 24th. Mrs. Helen wiped her hands on a towel. "Then we have 2 months to teach you how to tell if chicken is done without poisoning a roommate. I know how to cook some things. You know how to survive. Cooking is different." Richard smiled, but Annie's eyes stayed on the page. The date made college real, in a way the acceptance letter had not. August 24th meant boxes. A bed that was hers but not in Richard's house. A roommate who did not know her story. A campus where people would ask normal questions. "Where are you from? What's your major? Are your parents helping you move in?" She folded the letter carefully. Richard saw the shadow cross her face. "One thing at a time. I know. You don't have to know how August feels in June." Annie looked at him. "You always say things like that." "Annoying?" "A little." She tucked the letter back in the envelope. "But useful." The summer moved in practical steps. Grace helped Annie open a bank account and taught her how to check statements. Daniel extended her internship through August and gave her more responsibility with scholarship calls. At first, Annie hated calling students because she knew how hope sounded when it was trying not to beg. Then she became good at it. "Hi. This is Annie Johnson from Whitmore Foundation. I'm calling because your application is missing one document, and I don't want that to keep you from review." She said it gently, and students listened. One afternoon, Daniel stood near her desk while she finished a call with a boy whose mother's pay stub had been uploaded sideways. "You're good at that," he said. "At pay stubs? At making people feel like a mistake isn't the end." Annie looked down at her notes. "Somebody did that for me." Daniel nodded, then passed it on without turning it into a speech. "That's the work." Frank completed 30 days in treatment and chose a longer outpatient program. Grace told Annie only what Frank had given permission to share. He was living with Aunt Rose temporarily, working day labor, attending meetings, and calling Lily every night before bed. He did not call Annie. At first that hurt. Then Annie realized he was keeping the one promise he had made, not to make his recovery her responsibility. Lily called every Sunday afternoon from Aunt Rose's kitchen. Sometimes she talked about school, sometimes about Marilyn, who had moved in with a cousin across town and had been told by Grace, in writing, to stay away from Annie's workplace and residence. Sometimes Lily said very little and just breathed into the phone while Annie told her about campus brochures and Mrs. Helen's bad singing. In July, Annie visited Aunt Rose's apartment with Grace waiting downstairs in the car. Frank was not there. Lily ran into Annie's arms, then stepped back to study her. "You look different," Lily said. "Good different or bad different? Like your clothes fit." Annie laughed. "I'll take that." Before Annie left, Aunt Rose pressed a small plastic container into her hands. "Peach cobbler, your mama's recipe. I probably didn't do it as good." At Richard's house that night, Mrs. Helen tasted one bite and said, Rose did all right. Annie tasted it and had to sit down. What? Richard asked. It tastes like Sunday. No one spoke for a moment after that. In early August, Richard brought the suitcase down to his workshop, a clean room behind the garage that smelled of wood oil, leather, and old tools. Annie stood in the doorway. You don't have to fix it, she said. I know. It's supposed to look old. I'm not changing what it is, just making sure the handle survives another trip. She watched him remove the cracked leather wrap from the handle, careful not to tear it. He set the old piece aside instead of throwing it away. Then he fitted new brown leather around the grip, stitched it by hand, and rubbed the seam smooth with his thumb. My wife used to say repairs should confess a little, he said. What does that mean? That you don't pretend the break never happened. You make it strong and let it show where the hands worked. Annie picked up the old strip of leather. It was darker where her palm had held it through the cold night at the bus station. Can I keep this? Richard looked at her. Of course. She carried it upstairs and placed it beside the blue scarf on the desk. For 2 days she did not know what to do with it. Then Mrs. Helen found her trying to cut it with kitchen scissors. Lord, child, not those. You'll chew it to death. Helen brought sewing shears, a needle, strong thread, and a small brass eyelet from a drawer full of objects Annie suspected Helen had been saving since the Carter administration. Together they trimmed the old leather into a long, narrow strip. Annie stitched a small piece of her mother's blue scarf to one end, using a torn edge Grace said could be spared without ruining it. A bookmark, Helen said. For Richard. Helen's face softened. That's right. The night before move-in, Annie packed slowly. Clothes folded in neat stacks. Toiletries in a plastic caddy. Documents in the lockbox. Recipe cards in a small tin. Her mother's photograph wrapped in a sweater and placed near the top of the suitcase. She did not pack like a girl being thrown out. She packed like someone choosing what to carry. Richard knocked at the door. You ready? No. He leaned against the frame. Reasonable. She sat on the bed. What if I get there and everyone knows how to be normal except me? No one gets to college knowing how to be normal. They just arrive with better luggage. Annie looked at the old suitcase and smiled. Mine has character. It has survived poor management. She laughed, then grew quiet. Thank you for not buying me a new one. I thought about it. I know. It felt wrong. It would have been. Richard nodded. I'm learning. Annie looked around the room. The lamp, the quilt, the chair, the window where the suitcase had sat for months. I'm going to miss this room. It will still be here. I know. That's why I can leave it. Richard did not answer quickly. When he did, his voice was lower. That may be the bravest sentence you've said. Annie looked at him, embarrassed but not hiding. Don't make it big. All right. He stepped back. Good night, Annie. Good night, Richard. She slept under the quilt that night. Shoes in the closet, suitcase by the door for morning, not guarding an escape, waiting for a beginning. Morning came clear and cool, the kind of late August morning that made Cleveland look briefly forgiven. Annie woke before the alarm, not because fear pulled her up, but because the room felt ready. The suitcase stood by the door with the new brown leather handle Richard had stitched on, the old strip already turned into a bookmark and tucked inside a small envelope on her desk. Her mother's photograph was wrapped safely near the top, beside the recipe cards and the blue scarf. Downstairs, Mrs. Helen had made pancakes, eggs, and bacon, as if Annie were heading to war instead of college. You don't have to feed an entire dorm, Annie said, sliding into her chair. Mrs. Helen set down a plate. You say that now. Wait until you meet boys who think cereal is dinner. Richard came in carrying a cardboard box marked desk stuff in Grace's handwriting. Grace dropped this off at 7. She said if you forget to update your mailing address, she'll come to campus and embarrass you professionally. Annie smiled. That sounds like her. She also put a pepper spray keychain in the side pocket. Mrs. Helen nodded. That sounds like sense. Annie ate more than she thought she could. Richard drank coffee and read none of the newspaper open in front of him. Mrs. Helen kept finding reasons to walk past Annie's chair, adjusting a napkin, refilling juice, checking the pancakes, though everyone knew she was really checking Annie. When it was time to leave, Annie carried the suitcase to the front hall herself. Richard took the boxes. Mrs. Helen held the door open, then pulled Annie into a hug without asking this time, because some goodbyes had permission built into them. You call if the washing machines eat your quarters, Helen said. They don't take quarters anymore. It's a card system. Then call if the card system gets smart with you. Annie laughed into her shoulder. I will. The drive to Lake Erie State took less than an hour. Richard kept the radio low. Some old soul station Mrs. Helen had chosen before they left. Annie watched the city thin into suburbs, then into stretches of campus signs, fast food places, gas stations, and cars packed with bedding and plastic bins. At a stoplight, a minivan beside them had a father tying a lamp to the roof rack, while his daughter shouted directions through the window. Richard glanced over. You all right? No. He nodded. Fair. I'm not bad, just full. That's allowed. At the campus entrance, volunteers in bright shirts waved cars toward Maple Hall. Families crowded the sidewalks. Mothers carried pillows. Fathers argued with folding carts. Students stood around pretending not to be nervous while holding shower caddies and desk lamps. Annie stepped out of the car and looked at the building. Brick walls, wide windows, open doors, girls laughing near the steps. For a moment, she saw the bus station instead. Metal bench. Old suitcase. Cold air. No place to go. Then Richard set the suitcase beside her. Its repaired handle caught the sun. Ready? He asked. Not really. Want to go anyway? She looked at him and nodded. Yes. Her roommate, Claire, was already half moved in when they reached the second floor. Claire was from Toledo, talked fast, and had a mother who immediately asked Annie whether she needed extra hangers. Annie almost said no out of habit, then caught herself. Actually, maybe two? Claire's mother beamed like Annie had given her a job worth doing. I've got a whole bag. Richard carried in the boxes, then stepped back while Annie chose which side of the room she wanted. She picked the bed near the window, not because it was closest to the door, because the afternoon light fell there. Mrs. Helen had packed the quilt from the blue room despite Annie saying it was too much. Annie spread it across the narrow dorm bed. The room changed. Not into home, not yet, but into a place that could learn her. When everything was inside, Richard stood near the door with his hands in his pockets. Other parents were hugging, crying, giving last-minute instructions about laundry and cold medicine. Richard looked like a man facing a contract written in a language he respected but did not speak well. Annie opened the front pocket of her backpack and took out the envelope. I made you something. He accepted it carefully. Inside was the bookmark, cut from the old suitcase handle, smoothed at the edges, with a small strip of her mother's blue scarf stitched through the brass eyelet. Richard held it in his palm. This was the part I held when I had nowhere to go, Annie said. Her voice stayed steady until the last word. I want you to keep it, so you remember what you gave me. Richard looked down at it for a long moment. What did I give you? Annie looked at the suitcase by her new bed, at the campus outside the window, at the open door where voices passed and no one was shouting her name in anger. A place to stop running, she said. Then the courage to keep going. Richard closed his hand around the bookmark. His eyes shone, but he did not look away. I'm proud of you, Annie. She nodded, because if she tried to answer too quickly, she would cry. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. Richard held her gently, as if he understood that love did not need to grip hard to be real. When they pulled apart, Claire's mother was pretending to organize hangers with great interest. Richard cleared his throat. Call when you get settled. I will. And if anything feels wrong, I'll call Grace, then Daniel, then Mrs. Helen, then you. Why am I fourth? Because you'll panic first. Claire's mother laughed. Richard did too, though he looked wounded on principle. He left before the goodbye could become too heavy. Annie walked him to the stairwell, but not all the way to the car. That felt right. Some doors had to be crossed alone. From the second-floor window, she watched him reach the parking lot. He looked up once. Annie raised her hand. Richard raised the bookmark back. Small and brown and blue in the morning light. Then he got into the car and drove away. Annie returned to her room. Claire was hanging clothes. The hallway smelled of cardboard, shampoo, pizza, and new beginnings. Someone down the hall shouted that they had lost a phone charger. Someone's father sneezed 3 times. A resident assistant knocked on doors reminding everyone about the floor meeting at 6. Annie sat on the edge of her bed and placed her mother's photograph on the desk. Beside it, she set the recipe cards, her class schedule, and the blue folder from Whitmore Foundation. The suitcase stood open on the floor, almost empty now. She did not feel fixed. That was not how life worked. Marilyn's voice would still find her on hard days. Frank's absence would still ache. Lily would still need protecting in ways Annie could not always control. Some people would still look at her and decide too quickly what kind of girl she was. But the truth had witnesses now. Her future had paperwork. Her name was on a dorm room door, a class roster, a bank account, an internship file, and a scholarship letter she had earned. Annie took a breath, stood, and began unpacking. Outside, Richard drove back toward Cleveland with the bookmark on the passenger seat. At a red light, he touched the worn leather once, feeling the place where Annie's hand had held it through the coldest night of her life. He had spent years believing money could repair what mattered if only the check was large enough. Annie had taught him something quieter. Sometimes help began with food in a paper bag, a public bench, and refusing to let a stranger be shamed into silence. By the time he reached the highway, the sun had risen higher over the road. The passenger seat was empty, but not in the old way. Back on campus, Annie slid the suitcase under the bed. Not hidden, not guarded, just there, holding what it no longer had to carry. Then she picked up her student ID, opened the door, and stepped into the hall. This story reminds us that kindness is not always loud or grand. Sometimes it begins with one person stopping when everyone else walks by. Annie did not need pity. She needed someone to believe her, protect her dignity, and give her room to stand again. The lesson is simple. Never judge a wounded person by where you find them, because sometimes the strongest souls are the ones sitting quietly with everything they own in an old suitcase. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.